My wife texted at 2 a.m. Friday night. Something came up at work. Relax, I'll explain, Sue. I said, no need to explain. Stay with your boss, you're single now. 20 minutes later, she was frantically ringing the doorbell in tears. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was some kind of insomniac workaholic who thrived on 3 hours of sleep and motivational podcasts. The truth is, I was lying in bed at 2:03 a.m. on a Friday night, staring at my ceiling like it owed me money, trying desperately to memorize a presentation that my boss would probably tear apart anyway, because Greg from accounting always had one more suggestion that derailed the entire meeting. Work had been absolutely brutal that week. The kind of brutal where you start questioning if a paycheck is really worth slowly dying inside a beige cubicle under fluorescent lights that made everyone look like extras from a zombie movie. So yeah, I wasn't asleep. I was just lying there in the dark, rehearsing bullet points in my head and wondering if anyone had ever actually died from PowerPoint-induced stress. That's when my phone decided to ruin what was left of my already garbage evening. The screen lit up like a tiny nuclear explosion on my nightstand, and I squinted at it with the enthusiasm of a man who knew nothing good ever came from notifications after midnight. It was a text from Clara, my wife of 8 years, the woman who color-coded our grocery lists and sent passive-aggressive calendar invites for quality time, like we were business associates scheduling a merger. The message read, something came up at work. Relax, I'll explain, Sue. I had to read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because my brain physically rejected what it was seeing. Sue? Clara, the woman who once spent 20 minutes debating whether to use an Oxford comma in a birthday card, had just sent me a text with a typo. Clara, who corrected my grammar during arguments like she was grading a term paper, who literally had autocorrect on her autocorrect, had just casually thrown out Sue, like she was some teenager texting during math class. This was a woman who treated the English language like a sacred temple, and here she was, desecrating it at 2 in the morning with a 00 abomination. A typo from Clara wasn't just unusual. It was like watching a priest walk into a casino, sit down at the blackjack table, and ask the dealer if they accepted prayer as currency. Something was off. Way off. And I didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out what it was. Clara was supposed to be at a work dinner tonight, which apparently had now evolved into an after-hours situation that required staying out past midnight with her married boss, Richard, a guy who wore too much cologne and laughed at his own jokes like he was auditioning for a sitcom that nobody wanted to watch. She'd mentioned this dinner exactly 3 times over the past week, each time with a weird emphasis on how important and mandatory it was, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. And now here we were, in the dead of night, with her sending me typo-riddled damage control messages from God knows where. I sat up in bed, my heart doing that annoying thing where it speeds up, but you're trying to stay calm, because losing your cool at 2 a.m. feels dramatic even when it's completely justified. I stared at that message for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 30 seconds, watching the little typing dots appear and disappear like she was over there crafting the perfect follow-up lie. Part of me wanted to call her immediately and demand answers, but another part of me, the smarter, more petty part, knew exactly what to do. I opened the message thread, positioned my thumbs over the keyboard with the precision of a surgeon about to perform life-saving surgery, and typed out the most calm, collected, absolutely devastating response I could muster. No need to explain. Stay with your boss, you're single now. I read it once, twice, 3 times. Perfect. No emojis, no exclamation points, no angry misspellings that she could later use to paint me as the unhinged one. Just pure, concentrated peace wrapped in a single sentence that basically nuked 8 years of marriage in 26 characters. My finger hovered over the send button for maybe half a second before I thought, screw it, and pressed down like I was launching missiles. The message swooshed away into the digital void, and I felt this weird sense of calm wash over me. The kind of calm you feel when you finally make a decision you've been avoiding for way too long. And just like that, exactly 3 seconds after that message delivered, my phone started buzzing like it had been possessed by a swarm of angry bees auditioning for a horror movie. Call after call, text after text, the notifications rolling in so fast that my screen looked like a slot machine that just hit jackpot. I could see her name flashing over and over. Clara, Clara, Clara. Each call more desperate than the last, probably accompanied by whatever panicked explanation she'd frantically cobbled together in the parking lot of wherever she actually was. But here's the thing about finally reaching your limit with someone. You stop caring about their panic. You stop feeling obligated to answer just because they suddenly realize they screwed up. If Clara could stay out until 2 a.m. doing whatever sketchy nonsense she was doing, then she could stay out permanently as far as I was concerned. I reached over, picked up my phone with all the enthusiasm of someone picking up a piece of junk mail, and did something I'd been wanting to do for weeks without realizing it. I flipped it face down on the nightstand and rolled over. The buzzing continued, muffled now against the wood surface, sounding like an angry wasp trapped in a jar. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Call declined. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Call declined. It was almost rhythmic, almost soothing in a weird way, like the universe's most annoying white noise machine. Each ignored call felt like a tiny victory, a small reclamation of my dignity that had been slowly eroding over the past few months while I pretended not to notice Clara's increasingly suspicious behavior. I lay there in the dark, listening to my phone have a full-blown meltdown on my behalf, and realized something that probably should have occurred to me way earlier. I felt relieved. Not angry, not heartbroken, not even particularly surprised, just relieved. Relieved that I finally had a reason to stop pretending everything was fine. Relieved that I didn't have to keep making excuses for why my wife was suddenly working late 3 times a week. Relieved that I could finally stop lying to myself about what was clearly happening. The signs had been there for weeks, maybe even months. The new wardrobe full of clothes that were way too fancy for selling office furniture. The sudden interest in going to the gym at weird hours. The way she'd started angling her phone away from me when she texted, like I was some kind of corporate spy trying to steal classified information. My phone finally stopped buzzing around the 15th or 20th call. I'd honestly lost count, and the silence that followed was genuinely beautiful. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling more relaxed than I had in months, and thought about how wild it was that my entire marriage had basically ended via text message at 2 a.m. on a random Friday. No dramatic confrontation, no screaming match, no throwing dishes, or whatever people do in movies when relationships implode. Just a simple text message, a typo that gave away the game, and a calm response that sealed the deal. Honestly, it was almost poetic in its efficiency. As I finally started drifting off to sleep around 2:30, my last conscious thought was wondering how long it would take Clara to show up at the house, because there was absolutely no way she was going to accept that text message as the final word. I gave it maybe 20 minutes before I heard her car in the driveway, maybe 30 before she started banging on the door like the house was on fire. And you know what? I was absolutely right. But that's a problem for future Henry to deal with. Present Henry was going to enjoy this peaceful moment and maybe, just maybe, get a decent night's sleep for the first time in forever. I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of impressed with my own prediction skills because exactly 22 minutes after I sent that text. Yes, I checked the time because I'm petty like that. I heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching into our driveway like someone was auditioning for Fast and Furious, Suburban Meltdown Edition. The car door slammed with enough force to probably wake up everyone within a 3-block radius. And then came the frantic knocking that sounded less like knocking and more like someone trying to break through a door during a zombie apocalypse. But Clara wasn't satisfied with just the knocking. Oh no, that would be too subtle for the panic she was currently experiencing. She went straight for the doorbell. And I mean she went for it like it was a game show buzzer and the grand prize was saving her marriage. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. The doorbell was going off so repeatedly and aggressively that it stopped sounding like a doorbell and started sounding like a fire alarm having an existential crisis. I could picture her out there, finger glued to that button, probably crying, definitely panicking, absolutely losing whatever composure she thought she'd maintained during her little after-hours adventure with Richard the Boss Man. Part of me wondered if she'd eventually just break the doorbell entirely, and honestly, I wouldn't have been that upset about it because that thing was annoying even under normal circumstances. But here's the thing about being the one with the upper hand in a situation like this. You get to control the pace. You get to decide when and how things happen. So instead of rushing to the door like some desperate fool who was ready to accept whatever half-baked excuse she'd cooked up during her drive home, I decided to take my sweet time. I got out of bed with all the urgency of a sloth on vacation, stretched a little bit because my back had been killing me from that terrible office chair I'd been complaining about for months, and shuffled into the bathroom like it was just another regular night and not the dramatic implosion of my marriage. I brushed my teeth. Thoroughly. Like, I'm talking a full 2 minutes of brushing, the way dentists always tell you to do, but nobody actually does, because who has that kind of time in the morning? I even flossed, which I probably hadn't done in a week, because why not? Clara was out there having a complete meltdown, and I was in here practicing excellent oral hygiene. I caught my reflection in the mirror and had to admit, I looked pretty damn calm for a guy whose wife had just been caught red-handed, or should I say red-lipsticked, in what was definitely not a work emergency. My hair was a mess, sure, but there was something almost zen about my expression, like I'd achieved some kind of inner peace that only comes from finally stopping the denial and accepting reality for what it is. The doorbell was still going strong when I finally decided to put on a t-shirt. The one that said, "I'm not arguing, I'm just explaining why I'm right," which felt weirdly appropriate for the occasion. I took one last look in the mirror, nodded at myself like I was some kind of motivational speaker about to give the performance of a lifetime, and headed toward the front door with the casual energy of someone who was about to check if the pizza delivery guy had arrived, not confront his cheating wife. The knocking had evolved now into full-on pounding, the kind where you know someone's using both fists, and I could hear Clara's voice through the door, muffled but definitely frantic, yelling something about needing to explain. I stopped at the front door and looked through the peephole, because even in moments of marital destruction, home security is important, and what I saw was honestly better than any reality TV show I'd ever watched. There was Clara, and she looked absolutely wrecked. Her makeup, which had probably been perfectly applied earlier in the evening for her work dinner, was now smeared down her face like an abstract painting titled Bad Decisions. Her mascara had created these little black rivers down her cheeks, her lipstick, and yes, I noticed it was that expensive red shade she only wore for special occasions, was smudged across her face like she'd been making out with someone, which, let's be real, she definitely had been. Her hair, normally styled to perfection because Clara didn't do anything halfway, looked like she'd stuck her head out of a car window going 80 on the highway, all tangled and wild, and completely betraying whatever story she was about to try to sell me. I let her stew there for another 10 seconds, watching through the peephole as she went from pounding to pressing her face against the door, probably trying to hear if I was even home, which was hilarious, because where else would I be at almost 2:30 in the morning? Then I unlocked the deadbolt with the slowest, most deliberate motion I could manage, hearing it click in a way that made Clara immediately stop knocking and step back. I cracked the door open just enough to see her properly, but not enough for her to try to push her way in, because I'd seen enough movies to know that move was coming. "Please open the door, Henry. I can explain," she practically screamed, her voice doing that high-pitched, desperate thing that probably would have worked on me 6 months ago, but now just sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my expression as neutral as possible, and said, "Explain what? Why your work emergency required red lipstick and perfume that costs half my salary." I could smell it from where I was standing, that fancy designer perfume she'd bought last month and claimed was for boosting her confidence at work. Yeah, apparently her confidence needed boosting all the way into Richard's car or office, or wherever the hell they'd been. "It's not what you think," she stammered, and I had to physically stop myself from laughing because that exact line, has never in the history of caught cheaters ever been followed by anything good. "Oh really?" I said, letting the sarcasm drip from every word. "Because I think you won Employee of the Month in a very personal department, and I'm guessing the awards ceremony was very hands-on." Her eyes went wide, and she opened her mouth to respond, but I noticed something happening in my peripheral vision that made the whole situation even better. Lights were starting to come on in the neighbors' houses. First, it was old Mrs. Henderson across the street. That woman never missed any neighborhood drama. I swear she had some kind of gossip radar. Then the Johnsons' porch light flicked on next door, and I could see their curtains moving like they were settling in for the show. Even the Martinez family's upstairs window lit up, and I was pretty sure I saw their teenage son holding up his phone, probably recording this whole thing for TikTok or whatever the kids were using these days. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Let them all see the midnight soap opera. Let them watch Clara, the woman who was always so concerned about appearances and what the neighbors thought, have her complete breakdown on our front porch at 2:30 in the morning. The same woman who'd scolded me for leaving the garbage cans out too long because it looked tacky was now providing live entertainment for the entire street, while wearing the evidence of her affair like a scarlet letter made of smeared cosmetics. "Henry, please, can we talk inside?" Clara whispered urgently, finally noticing that we had acquired an audience. She kept trying to see past me into the house, like she thought she could just walk in and we'd have some quiet, rational conversation where she'd explain away everything and I'd nod and forgive her because that's what we were supposed to do after 8 years of marriage. "Nah, I'm good right here," I said, getting more comfortable against the doorframe. "Besides, I think the neighbors deserve some entertainment. Mrs. Henderson hasn't had this much excitement since her cat got stuck in a tree last summer." I was pretty sure I heard someone chuckle from one of the nearby houses, which just made the whole thing even more satisfying. Clara's face cycled through about 17 different emotions in 5 seconds. Embarrassment, anger, desperation, panic, and finally landing on what I can only describe as the realization that she had absolutely zero control over this situation. Her perfect little world, the one where she could have her stable marriage and her exciting affair, and keep both running smoothly without anyone finding out, had just exploded spectacularly in the most public way possible. And honestly, I was living for every second of it. "You're being ridiculous," she hissed, trying to keep her voice down now that she'd realized half the neighborhood was watching her personal disaster unfold in real time. "Ridiculous?" I repeated, raising my voice just enough that Mrs. Henderson could definitely hear me. "No. What's ridiculous is you thinking I'm stupid enough to believe whatever excuse you're about to make up on the spot." I paused for dramatic effect, because why not? "So go ahead, Clara. The stage is yours. Explain to me and everyone watching why you're coming home at 2:30 in the morning looking like you lost a fight with a makeup counter." The look on her face told me she was about to launch into her explanation, and I was absolutely ready for whatever ridiculous story she'd concocted during her panic drive home. This was going to be good. Clara took a deep breath, and I could literally see her brain working overtime trying to construct whatever fictional masterpiece she was about to present as the truth. Her eyes were darting around like she was reading invisible cue cards floating in the air, and I had to give her credit for one thing. She was really committed to this performance. Too bad I'd already seen the ending and knew it sucked. "My boss called about a deadline," she blurted out, and I swear I almost applauded right there because that was her opening statement. That was the best she could come up with after a 22-minute drive where she presumably had time to craft the perfect alibi. I'd seen better lies from politicians caught with offshore bank accounts. I nodded slowly, pretending to consider this absolutely groundbreaking explanation. "A deadline," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a bad smell. "At 2 a.m.? Clara, you're not a trauma surgeon saving lives. You're not a firefighter responding to emergencies. You sell office chairs. Office chairs. The kind of furniture that people sit on from 9 to 5 during business hours, when deadlines are actually relevant." I paused, watching her face cycle through emotions like a slot machine. "So unless someone urgently needed a ergonomic lumbar support system delivered to their house in the middle of the night, I'm calling bullshit on that one." Her mouth opened and closed a few times, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she scrambled for version 2.0 of her terrible excuse. Mrs. Henderson's porch light was still on, across the street, and I was 99% sure I saw her standing at her window with binoculars, which was honestly the kind of energy I needed in my life right now. The woman was committed to her craft. "Okay, fine," Clara started, and I loved how she said it like she was doing me some huge favor by upgrading from one lie to a slightly different lie. His wife was sick, and he needed someone to talk to. It was an emotional emergency, Henry. I was being a good colleague, showing compassion during a difficult time. She actually put her hand over her heart when she said this, like she was some kind of humanitarian accepting an award for exceptional workplace empathy. I blinked at her. Once. Twice. Then I said, completely deadpan, "He's divorced. You know that sound that vinyl records make when someone scratches them? That screech noise? That's basically what happened in Clara's brain at that exact moment. Her entire face froze like someone had hit pause on a DVD player. Her hand was still over her heart in that fake compassionate gesture, but her eyes had gone completely blank, like her internal operating system had just crashed and was showing nothing but a blue screen of death. "What?" she whispered, and I could see the panic starting to really set in now because she'd just been caught in such an easily disprovable lie that even she couldn't figure out how to spin it. "Richard got divorced 6 months ago," I explained, speaking slowly like I was teaching a kindergarten class basic edition. "Remember? You told me about it. You came home all concerned about how he was handling the separation, how sad he seemed, how he was really struggling with being alone." I tapped my chin thoughtfully. "Actually, now that I think about it, that's right around when you started all these late-night work emergencies, isn't it? Funny how that timing works out." Clara looked like she was trying to mentally time travel back to 6 months ago to remember what lies she'd already told me so she could keep her story straight, but it was way too late for that. The ship had sailed, the train had left the station, and the horse had left the barn. Pick your metaphor, they all applied. She was drowning, and I was just standing there on the shore, refusing to throw her a life preserver. "I meant," she stammered, and I could see her eyes doing that thing again where they looked everywhere except at me, like the answer to her problems was written on our porch ceiling or hidden in the bushes. "His dog was sick." "Yeah, his dog. He has that golden retriever, remember? And she's old, and he thought she might not make it through the night, and he was really upset about it." I let that statement sit in the silence for a moment, just marinating in its own absurdity, while I contemplated whether my wife had actually just suggested that she stayed out until 2:30 in the morning to provide emotional support for a man whose hypothetical dog was hypothetically dying. The creativity was almost impressive if it wasn't so insulting to my intelligence. "Right?" I said, drawing out the word like it had about 15 extra syllables. "So you went to comfort the dog. That makes total sense. Tell me, did you bring flowers for the funeral? Or did you go with a nice chew toy as a get-well-soon gift? Maybe some of those fancy organic dog treats from that expensive pet store downtown?" I crossed my arms, really getting into the performance now. Clara's face went from pale to red so fast I was worried she might actually spontaneously combust right there on my porch, which would have been unfortunate because I'd just had the wood refinished last summer and bloodstains were probably not covered under warranty. She opened her mouth to respond, probably to dig herself even deeper into this hole she'd created, but I could see the exact moment when her brain just gave up entirely. Her eyes went kind of vacant, like a robot whose programming had encountered an error it couldn't resolve, and I swear I could almost hear the Windows shutdown noise playing in her head. "You're impossible," she finally cried, and I had to laugh because that was her defense now. I was impossible. I wasn't the one making up increasingly ridiculous stories about sick wives who weren't sick and weren't wives, and dying dogs that probably didn't exist, at 2:30 in the morning while covered in evidence of an affair. "No, just awake," I corrected her. "Very, very awake. And also not stupid, which seems to be a quality you were banking on me having tonight." That's when I noticed something that made this entire situation even better, if that was possible. Clara's car was sitting in the driveway, parked at this weird angle like she'd been in such a rush that she'd forgotten how parking worked. But here's the thing that made me pause. Her car was here, in our driveway. She hadn't even left the neighborhood, probably. If she'd actually been at the office with Richard like she'd claimed, or at his place comforting his sick fake wife or dying fake dog, she would have had to drive at least 20 minutes each way. But looking at her car, looking at the way she'd peeled into the driveway, looking at how fast she'd gotten here after my text, I did some quick mental math and realized something hilarious. "So tell me, Clara," I said, and I could feel the smile spreading across my face despite my best efforts to maintain my cool, detached demeanor. "Did your boss teleport you to the office? Because according to my very basic understanding of time and space, there's no way you could have been where you said you were and made it back here as fast as you did. Unless Richard has access to some kind of Star Trek transporter technology that I don't know about. In which case, honestly, I'm more impressed than angry." Her face did something I'd never seen before. It was like watching someone realize they'd just failed a test they thought they'd aced. Every muscle in her face seemed to be fighting against every other muscle, creating this expression that was part horror, part disbelief, and part resignation. She knew she was caught. Not just caught in a lie, but caught in a whole web of lies that were contradicting each other and falling apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. She started, But nothing came after that. Just I, hanging in the air like a lonely word that had lost all its friends. You what? I prompted, leaning forward slightly. You were actually parked 2 blocks away in the McDonald's parking lot making out with your boss in his car, like you're both 16 years old again? You were at that sketchy motel off Highway 9 that charges by the hour and has a sign that says clean rooms, which automatically means the rooms are definitely not clean? Where were you, Clara? Because it definitely wasn't where you said you were. And that's when the tears really started. Not the cute, delicate tears you see in movies where one single drop rolls down a perfectly made-up face. No, these were the ugly tears, the ones that come with snot and hiccuping and that weird gasping sound people make when they're trying to cry and breathe at the same time and failing at both. Her mascara, which had already been doing a pretty terrible job of staying where it was supposed to be, completely gave up and created these black streaks down her face that made her look like a sad raccoon who'd just been caught going through someone's garbage. I stood there watching this performance, and honestly, part of me was impressed by the commitment. If lying was an Olympic sport, Clara wouldn't win gold, but she'd definitely get points for artistic interpretation. If terrible excuses burned calories, she'd have abs that could cut diamonds by now. But mostly, I just felt tired. Tired of the lies, tired of the drama, tired of pretending that I hadn't known something was wrong for weeks now. Let's make this easy, I finally said. Clara was in full meltdown mode now, doing that thing where she was crying so hard that actual words were becoming difficult to form, and honestly, I'd had about enough of this outdoor theater production. We'd been standing at my doorway for what felt like an eternity, and I was getting tired of watching her try to juggle 17 different lies while simultaneously having an emotional breakdown. It was like watching someone try to play Jenga during an earthquake. Messy, chaotic, and destined to end badly. Let's make this easy, I said, cutting through her sobs like a knife through butter. Let's skip past all the creative fiction and the award-worthy acting and get to the part where you tell me the truth. I'm going to ask you one simple question, and I want one simple answer. No stories about sick wives, dying dogs, or emergency furniture deadlines. Just yes or no. Can you handle that? She looked up at me with those red, puffy eyes, mascara still making its tragic journey down her face, and nodded weakly like a bobblehead that had given up on life. I could see her trying to brace herself for whatever question was coming, probably running through a mental checklist of which lies she could still salvage and which ones were completely torched. Who is it? I asked, keeping my voice steady and calm, like I was asking her what she wanted for dinner and not who she'd been cheating on me with. She froze, completely froze, like someone had hit pause on her entire existence. Her mouth was slightly open, one hand still clutching the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright, and I watched as every possible response flickered across her face in real time. She was calculating whether she could still deny it, whether she could spin this into something less damaging, whether she could somehow make this my fault instead of hers. I'd been married to this woman for 8 years. I could read her like a book, and right now, that book was titled, "Oh shit, I'm caught and I don't know what to do." I was with someone, she finally whispered, and I had to resist the urge to slow clap because wow, what a confession. So Vega was basically useless, but I guess she thought that admitting to someone was somehow better than admitting to a specific person with a specific name who was specifically her married boss. The boss? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. But see, this was important. I needed to hear her say it. I needed her to actually admit it out loud instead of hiding behind pronouns and vague statements that could technically be interpreted multiple ways if you squinted hard enough. Clara's face went completely white, like someone had literally drained all the blood from her head. Her eyes got huge, and she looked at me like I'd just performed some kind of black magic mind-reading trick instead of just connecting the incredibly obvious dots that a golden retriever could have connected. How did you? She started, but the words died in her throat because she'd just confirmed it without actually meaning to confirm it. I smiled, and not a friendly smile either. This was the smile of someone who'd just won an argument before it even started. Lucky guess, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Also, I'm not blind. You've been dressing like LinkedIn Barbie for weeks now. New clothes, new hair, new perfume, suddenly caring about looking professional when you're literally selling chairs to people who don't care if you show up in a potato sack as long as the price is right. The dots weren't exactly hard to connect, Clara. They were practically drawing themselves. I thought about all those mornings over the past few weeks when she'd spend an extra hour getting ready for work, trying on 3 different outfits and asking me which one looked more professional, whatever that meant. I thought about how she'd started going to the gym at weird hours, how her phone had suddenly become this Fort Knox-level secure device that she never let out of her sight, how she'd developed this nervous habit of angling it away from me whenever a notification popped up. I thought about all the times she'd mentioned Richard's name in conversation, always with this weird emphasis, like she was testing how I'd react to hearing about him. The signs had been there the whole time. I'd just been choosing to ignore them because acknowledging them meant dealing with them, and dealing with them meant blowing up my entire life. She cried harder now, these big, heaving sobs that shook her whole body, and I wondered if she was crying because she felt genuinely guilty or because she'd gotten caught. There's a difference, you know. One is actual remorse about hurting someone you supposedly love, and the other is just being upset that your secret fun time had come to an end. Based on the way she kept glancing at her phone like she was hoping Richard would call with some magical solution to this disaster, I was betting on option 2. It wasn't planned. She managed to choke out between sobs, and I actually laughed out loud at that one. Couldn't help it. That line, "It wasn't planned," was right up there with "It just happened," and it didn't mean anything in the cheater's handbook of terrible excuses that nobody believes. "Oh yes," I said, really leaning into the sarcasm now because if I didn't laugh, I was probably going to punch a wall, and I'd already mentioned that I didn't want to punch walls. The classic, "the printer jammed," and so did my moral story. I've heard that one before. It's a real page-turner. Let me guess how it goes. You were both working late, probably on some made-up project that definitely required you to be alone together after hours. And then there was this moment, this magical moment where you looked at each other, and suddenly 8 years of marriage just evaporated like morning dew. And before you knew it, whoops, you accidentally fell onto his dick. Multiple times. Over several weeks. What a tragic accident. Clara gasped like I'd just slapped her, which was rich considering she was the one who'd been conducting a full-blown affair, and I was just the guy pointing out the obvious. "Can you stop making jokes?" she asked, her voice going up about 3 octaves into that territory where dogs could probably hear it, but humans were struggling. "Not really," I admitted, shrugging. "Humor helps me not punch walls. And trust me, you want me making jokes right now because the alternative is significantly less pleasant for both of us." I leaned against the doorframe again, getting comfortable because this conversation was clearly going to last longer than I'd initially anticipated. "Besides, what do you want me to do? Cry? Beg you to stay? Fall on my knees and ask what I did wrong to drive you into the arms of Richard, the divorced office chair mogul with the overpriced cologne and the midlife crisis sports car?" I could see our other neighbors now. The Johnsons had actually come out onto their porch with what looked like popcorn, which was honestly the kind of commitment to neighborhood drama that I respected. Mr. Martinez was definitely recording this on his phone, probably already planning how to edit it for maximum viral potential. Mrs. Henderson had upgraded from binoculars to standing directly at her window, completely unashamed about her front row seat to the Henderson Street Theater production of Marriage Collapse, the musical. Clara noticed our audience too and tried to lower her voice, leaning in closer to the door like that would somehow make this conversation more private despite the fact that she'd been screaming and crying loud enough to wake up the entire zip code for the past 20 minutes. "Can we please talk about this inside?" she whispered desperately. "This is humiliating." "Oh, now it's humiliating?" I asked, raising my eyebrows. "It wasn't humiliating when you were sneaking around with your boss? It wasn't humiliating when you were lying to my face about work dinners and sick dogs? It wasn't humiliating when you sent me that text message with a typo because you were too busy doing God knows what to proofread? But now that people are watching, suddenly you're worried about being humiliated." I shook my head. "Sorry, Clara, but you don't get to control the narrative anymore. You lost that privilege when you decided to throw away our marriage for someone who probably still uses Internet Explorer." She reached out like she was going to grab my arm, do that thing where she touched me and looked into my eyes and tried to make me remember all the good times we'd had together, all the reasons I'd married her in the first place. But I stepped back before she could make contact, and I saw something break in her face when I did that. Like she'd just realized that maybe, just maybe, This wasn't something she could fix with tears and touching and empty promises. At least you picked someone with a decent salary, I continued, because apparently I wasn't done twisting the knife yet. Would have been embarrassing if it was the IT guy, Derek, with his Lord of the Rings lunchbox and his collection of anime figurines. At least Richard can probably afford to take you to restaurants that don't have a drive-through window. Though honestly, given the choice between someone who's passionate about programming and someone who's passionate about ergonomic office solutions, I might have gone with Derek. At least he has interesting hobbies. Her tears kicked into turbo mode, and I was genuinely starting to wonder if she was going to dehydrate herself right there on my porch. The crying had reached that level where it wasn't even producing sound anymore, just this weird gasping, hiccuping thing that made her whole body shudder. Part of me, a very small part that was buried under about 17 layers of anger and betrayal, felt bad for being so harsh. But then I remembered that she'd spent the last however many weeks lying to my face, and that small part of me shut up real quick. You don't understand, she managed to say through the sobs. It's complicated. No, it's really not, I said flatly. It's actually incredibly simple. You wanted to have an affair, so you had an affair. You wanted to feel desired and exciting and like you were the main character in some romantic drama instead of just a regular person in a regular marriage, so you went out and made that happen. The only complicated part is all the lying you had to do to keep it going, and honestly, you weren't even good at that part. I could tell she wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the ways it actually was complicated and how I just didn't understand what she was going through. But we both knew that anything she said at this point was just going to dig the hole deeper. She'd already confirmed the affair, already admitted to being with someone, already accidentally revealed it was Richard. The damage was done. The marriage was over. All that was left now was the cleanup. I'd had enough of standing at the doorway having this conversation that was going absolutely nowhere except in circles of tears and terrible excuses. My feet were getting cold on the hardwood floor. The neighbors had probably seen enough drama to last them through the next 5 homeowners association meetings, and honestly, I needed caffeine if I was going to continue dealing with this absolute dumpster fire of a situation. So I did what any reasonable person would do at almost 3 in the morning while their marriage imploded. I turned around and headed for the kitchen to make coffee. Where are you going? Clara called after me, her voice cracking with panic like I was abandoning her in the middle of a burning building instead of just walking away from my own front door in my own house. To make coffee, I called back over my shoulder, not even bothering to turn around. Because apparently I handle betrayal with caffeine and sarcasm, and I'm currently running low on one of those things. I heard her footsteps behind me, that distinct clicking sound her fancy heels made on the floor, the same heels she'd bought last month claiming they were on sale, but definitely weren't. The same heels she'd probably worn specifically for Richard because she knew they made her legs look good. Everything was starting to make sense now. All those little purchases and wardrobe upgrades that she'd explained away as treating herself or boosting her professional image. Yeah, professional. Right. She followed me into the kitchen, still crying, still looking like she'd been through an emotional blender set on the highest speed. And I ignored her while I went through the familiar ritual of making coffee. I pulled out my favorite mug, the one that said "World's Okayest Husband," which felt weirdly appropriate now, and started measuring out the grounds with the kind of precision usually reserved for bomb defusal. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and the smell started filling the kitchen, that rich, dark aroma that was basically the only thing keeping me from completely losing my mind right now. Clara stood there in the middle of my kitchen, wringing her hands like some kind of Victorian heroine from a tragic novel, and I could tell she was trying to figure out her next move. Should she keep crying? Should she try apologizing again? Should she attempt to explain herself more clearly? I could practically see the gears turning in her head, trying to calculate which approach would work best, which version of herself she should present to get the outcome she wanted. You can't just throw away 8 years, she finally blurted out. And there it was. The appeal to our history together, the classic move of someone who'd screwed up and was now trying to use time investment as leverage. Like our marriage was some kind of sunk cost fallacy that I had to honor because we'd already put in the work. I turned around slowly, leaning against the counter while the coffee maker did its thing behind me, and looked at her with the kind of expression you'd give someone who just claimed the earth was flat. Funny, I said, letting each word land with weight. You threw them first. In fact, You've probably been throwing them for weeks, maybe months, every single time you chose to lie to me. Every time you got dressed up for him. Every time you deleted a text message or angled your phone away from me like I was some kind of surveillance camera you needed to avoid. The coffee maker beeped, that cheerful little sound that meant my salvation was ready, and I turned to pour myself a cup, taking my time with it like I was some kind of coffee sommelier, and this was a tasting event. I added cream, stirred it slowly, watching the dark liquid swirl and lighten into that perfect caramel color. Clara was still standing there, watching me like she couldn't believe I was casually making coffee while our marriage burned down around us. But honestly, what did she expect? Did she think I'd collapse into a sobbing heap on the kitchen floor? That I'd beg her to explain everything and promise to forgive her if she just came clean? I took a sip, perfect temperature, perfect flavor, probably the best coffee I'd made in weeks, and pulled out my phone from my pocket. Clara's eyes widened when she saw it, probably thinking I was about to show her screenshots or evidence or something equally dramatic, but the truth was way better than that. By the way, I said casually, scrolling through my recent calls, that buzzing earlier? After I sent you that text? That wasn't all from you. I held up my phone so she could see the screen. See this call at 2:17? That's my lawyer. Jonathan. Nice guy, went to law school with my buddy Steve, specializes in divorce cases. He's meeting me at 9. Clara's face went through about 17 different shades of white and pale before settling on something that looked like absolute horror. You called a lawyer before talking to me? She whispered, and I had to appreciate the audacity of that statement, like I was the one who'd done something wrong by being prepared. Yep, I said, popping the P for emphasis and taking another sip of my excellent coffee. I called him right after you started blowing up my phone with all those panicked calls I didn't answer. Took me about 30 seconds to find his number and about 2 minutes to explain the situation. You know what he said? He said, "Good for you for not waiting." And then he told me to document everything and not let you back in the house. So technically, I'm already failing at following legal advice, but I figured I'd at least let you dig your own grave a little deeper before I completely shut the door on this whole situation. She looked like she was going to faint or throw up, or possibly both at the same time. Her hand reached out for the kitchen counter to steady herself, and I watched with a strange sense of detachment as she processed what I'd just told her. But we haven't even talked about this. We haven't tried to work it out. You can't just give up without even trying. Can't I though? I asked, genuinely curious about her logic here. You called your boss before talking to me, remember? You made plans to meet up with him at whatever location you were at without consulting me. You decided to have an entire affair without including me in that decision-making process. So why exactly do I need to consult you before deciding that I'm done with this marriage? What? Do I need to file a formal request? Submit it in triplicate? Wait for approval from the Department of Broken Trust? Clara tried to grab my arm, reaching out with that desperate energy of someone who'd just realized they'd lost control of the entire situation. Please, Henry, you're not thinking straight. You're angry and you're hurt, and you're not making rational decisions right now. I stepped back before she could touch me, again, because I was not about to let her use physical contact as some kind of emotional manipulation tactic. No, Clara, I'm thinking perfectly straight for the first time in months. You know when I wasn't thinking straight? When I ignored all those red flags. When I pretended not to notice that you were pulling away. When I convinced myself that you were just stressed from work and that everything was fine. That's when I wasn't thinking straight. Right now? Right now I'm thinking with crystal clarity. And that clarity is telling me that I deserve better than someone who lies to my face and then expects me to stick around for the apology tour. She was full-on sobbing again, that ugly crying that comes with snot and hiccups and gasping breaths. And normally, in any other situation, I would have felt bad. I would have offered her a tissue, maybe a glass of water, some kind of comfort. But standing there in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, drinking my perfectly made coffee while she cried about consequences she'd brought on herself, I just felt tired. Not angry anymore, not even particularly hurt, just exhausted by the entire situation. You don't understand how hard this has been for me, she managed to say through the tears, and wow, that was bold. That was impressively bold. She was really going to try to make herself the victim here? Hard for you, I repeated, my voice going dangerously quiet. Let me tell you what's been hard. Hard has been lying in bed every night wondering why my wife doesn't want to touch me anymore. Hard has been watching you get excited about going to work and realizing you've never been that excited about coming home. Hard has been pretending everything is fine while you slowly checked out of this marriage one lie at a time. So forgive me if I don't have a lot of sympathy for how hard it's been for you to juggle a husband and a boyfriend simultaneously. I finished my coffee, still the best cup I'd made in weeks. Honestly, this whole crisis was really bringing out my barista skills, and rinsed the mug in the sink, taking my time with it because I knew it was driving Clara crazy that I was being so calm and methodical about everything. She wanted drama, wanted big emotional reactions, wanted me to either explode in anger or collapse in grief so she could know how to respond. But I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. So here's how this is going to work, I said, drying my hands on a dish towel and turning to face her with the kind of composure I didn't actually feel but was faking really well. You're going to leave. You're going to go stay with your mom, or your sister, or hell, go stay with Richard for all I care. I'm sure he's got plenty of room now that he's divorced. And I'm going to meet with Jonathan at 9 o'clock, and we're going to start the paperwork to end this marriage as quickly and cleanly as possible. You'll get your stuff, I'll get mine. We'll divide everything like adults, and then we can both move on with our lives. I don't want a divorce, she whispered, and I almost laughed at how absurd that statement was coming from someone who'd literally been cheating on me. Well, I didn't want a cheating wife, but we don't always get what we want, do we? I said, life's funny that way, full of little disappointments and betrayals and moments where you realize that the person you married isn't actually the person standing in front of you anymore. I sipped my coffee dramatically. Okay, it was actually just water at this point since I'd already finished the coffee, but I'd refilled the mug and the dramatic sipping motion still worked, while she sobbed like a malfunctioning sprinkler system that someone had set to the highest pressure setting. The sound was honestly impressive in its intensity, like she was trying to cry out enough tears to fill a small pool, and I wondered briefly if this was genuine emotion or just another performance designed to manipulate me into changing my mind. Either way, it wasn't working. My mind was made up. Jonathan was already aware of the situation and preparing whatever paperwork needed to be prepared, and I was done. Completely, totally, exhaustively done with this entire situation. All I wanted now was for Clara to leave so I could finally get some sleep in my own house without wondering where my wife was, or who she was with, or what lies she was telling. I thought the drama had peaked. I really did. I genuinely believed that we'd hit maximum chaos levels for one night, and that things couldn't possibly get more ridiculous. But then again, I'd also believed my wife was working late and not conducting an affair with her divorced boss. So clearly my judgment about what could and couldn't happen was completely shot. It was around 5 a.m. Yes, we'd been at this for almost 3 hours now, which should tell you everything you need to know about how this night was going. When my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately and dreaded deeply. Margaret, Clara's mother, calling from whatever time zone she was currently residing in with the kind of timing that suggested Clara had absolutely called her the second she'd gotten a moment alone. I stared at the phone for a solid 5 seconds, watching Margaret's name flash on the screen like a warning beacon, and seriously considered not answering. But then I thought, you know what? Why not? Let's make this a full family affair. Let's get everyone involved in this spectacular implosion of my marriage. Maybe we could sell tickets, make it a whole event, get some sponsors involved. The neighbors were already invested. Might as well bring in the extended family too. I hit the answer button and barely got the phone to my ear before Margaret's voice came through. And let me tell you, she did not sound happy. Henry, what is going on? Clara just called me absolutely hysterical, saying you locked her out of the house and won't talk to her. Her voice had that sharp, accusatory edge that mothers get when they think someone has wronged their child, and I could already tell this conversation was going to be a ride. I glanced over at Clara, who was sitting at my kitchen table now, still crying, but in a more subdued way, like she'd finally hit the limit of how many tears a human body could physically produce in one night. She was staring at her phone, probably waiting for her mother to call back with news that she'd successfully guilt-tripped me into taking her back. Poor Clara. She really didn't know her mother as well as she thought she did. Did she also mention the part where she's been having an affair with her boss? I asked, keeping my voice pleasant and conversational, like I was discussing the weather or weekend plans instead of infidelity. Or did she leave that detail out of her hysterical phone call? The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that I actually checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. But no, Margaret was still there, just processing what I'd just told her with what I imagined was the same expression someone would have if you told them their dog had learned to speak French. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she said in a very different tone, "What?" "Yeah," I continued, walking out of the kitchen and into the living room so I could have this conversation without Clara staring at me like a sad puppy. Turns out those work dinners she's been going to, not actually work dinners, more like romantic dinners, with her married boss. Except he's divorced, so I guess technically it's romantic dinners with her divorced boss, which somehow doesn't make it better even though Clara seemed to think mentioning his marital status would help her case. "Clara." Margaret's voice went sharp enough to cut glass. "Is this true?" I could hear Clara's response from the kitchen. That small, pathetic, "It was a mistake," that she'd been recycling all night like it was going to suddenly become more effective through repetition. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Margaret's voice came back on the line, and now she sounded less like an angry mother defending her child, and more like an angry mother who'd just discovered her child had done something monumentally stupid. "Henry, I am so sorry. I had no idea. When did this start? How long has this been going on?" "Honestly, Margaret, your guess is as good as mine," I said, settling onto my couch with the kind of exhaustion that comes from being awake for over 24 hours and dealing with emotional chaos for 3 of them. Based on the timeline I've pieced together from her increasingly terrible lies, I'm guessing at least 6 weeks, maybe longer. Could be months for all I know. She's not exactly being forthcoming with details, and frankly, I don't really care anymore. The when doesn't matter as much as the fact that it happened at all. 6 weeks. Margaret's voice went up about 3 octaves, and I heard some rustling on her end like she was getting out of bed, which she probably was since it was stupid early in the morning. "Clara Marie Henderson, you have been lying to your husband for 6 weeks. Clara's full name. Oh man, she was in trouble now. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered the whole cheating thing, and the feeling passed pretty quickly. "It wasn't planned, Mom." Clara called out from the kitchen, and I had to hand it to her. She was really committed to that line. If they gave out awards for most consistently used terrible excuse, she'd be a shoo-in for the trophy. "Apparently it just happened," I added helpfully into the phone. "You know, like how rain just happens, or traffic jams just happen, or how you just accidentally trip and fall into an affair with your boss that lasts for weeks and involves elaborate lies about work emergencies and sick dogs that don't exist. Classic case of things just happening beyond anyone's control." Margaret made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a growl. "Henry, I don't even know what to say. I raised her better than this. I know I raised her better than this." "You did," I assured her, and I meant it. Margaret wasn't a bad person, and she'd actually been a pretty decent mother-in-law over the years. She baked cookies for every holiday, remembered my birthday, never did that passive-aggressive thing where she criticized Clara through complimenting me. She was genuinely one of the good ones. "This isn't on you. Clara's an adult who made adult decisions, and now she gets to deal with adult consequences. That's how life works. What are you going to do?" Margaret asked, and I could hear the resignation in her voice, like she already knew the answer but had to ask anyway. "I've already called my lawyer," I said flatly. "We're meeting at 9. I'm filing for divorce as soon as humanly possible because I'm not interested in dragging this out or trying to work through it, or whatever people are supposed to do when they find out their spouse has been cheating on them. Clara made her choice, and now I'm making mine." "Good," Margaret said, and I actually had to pull the phone away from my ear to make sure I'd heard her correctly. Did my mother-in-law just say good? To me divorcing her daughter? "I'm sorry, Henry. You deserve better than this. You've always been good to her, always treated her well, and this is how she repays you? By sneaking around with her boss like some kind of..." She cut herself off, probably remembering that Clara was still her daughter despite being a terrible wife. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, genuinely touched by her response. "That actually means a lot. I was kind of expecting you to defend her, or try to convince me to give her another chance, or do the whole marriage is sacred speech." "Oh, marriage is sacred," Margaret said firmly, which is exactly why what she did is so unforgivable. You don't treat sacred things like garbage and then expect them to still work. She broke something that can't be fixed with apologies and tears, and she needs to understand that. "Clara, are you listening to me?" I heard Clara's muffled, "Yes, Mom," from the kitchen, and I could picture her sitting there, probably feeling like she was 12 years old again and getting lectured for breaking curfew. Except this time the consequences were slightly more severe than losing her allowance. I want you to go to your sister's house, Margaret continued, her voice taking on that commanding tone that mothers perfect over decades of dealing with children who don't want to do what they're told. Right now? Tonight. This morning. Whatever time it is there. You're going to pack a bag. You're going to leave Henry alone, and you're going to give him the space he clearly needs and deserves. And then you and I are going to have a very long conversation about why you thought destroying your marriage was a good idea. But Mom, Clara started, but Margaret cut her off faster than a knife through butter. No buts. You don't get to, but you're way out of this one. You made your bed. Now you get to lie in it. Or rather, you get to lie in your sister's guest room while you figure out what you're going to do with the rest of your life now that you've blown up your marriage for someone who probably isn't even going to stay with you once he realizes you're available and the excitement of sneaking around is gone. Damn, Margaret was absolutely destroying Clara right now, and I was here for every second of it. I'd always liked my mother-in-law, but I was loving her right now. She was saying all the things I'd been thinking but hadn't quite articulated because I was too busy being sarcastic and making coffee. Margaret, I have to say, I interjected, unable to help myself. Thank you for raising a woman who at least feels guilt on command. That's something, I guess. Not enough to save the marriage, but it's a quality that exists. Margaret actually laughed, though it was one of those bitter laughs that people do when something is more sad than funny. Henry, you're a better man than she deserves. You've always been too good for her. I just didn't realize how true that was until right now. I appreciate that, I said sincerely. And I appreciate you not doing the thing where you try to defend her or make excuses or blame me for somehow driving her into another man's arms. That's refreshingly honest. There's no excuse for cheating, Margaret said firmly. None. I don't care if you'd been the worst husband in the world, which you weren't. She should have either tried to fix things or left you before starting something with someone else. That's what adults do. That's what people with integrity do. This sneaking around, this lying, this betraying someone who trusted you, that's coward behavior, and I didn't raise a coward. I could hear Clara crying again in the kitchen, harder now, probably because having your own mother's side with your soon-to-be ex-husband was hitting differently than having your husband be angry at you. There was something about parental disappointment that cut deeper than almost anything else, and right now, Margaret was serving it up with the efficiency of someone who'd been perfecting the art of maternal disappointment for decades. She's going to call you back, Margaret said, her voice softening slightly. After she calms down, she's going to try to apologize and explain and make you understand why she did what she did. Don't answer if you don't want to. You don't owe her anything at this point. I wasn't planning on it, I assured her. My lawyer already advised me to limit contact, and honestly, I've heard enough lies and excuses tonight to last me a lifetime. Whatever she has to say, she can say it through her lawyer once she gets one. When we hung up a few minutes later, after Margaret had given me her personal number and told me to call her if I needed anything or if Clara tried to harass me, I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. Not just relief that someone was on my side, but relief that I wasn't crazy for thinking this was unforgivable. By the time sunrise rolled around, and yes, I'd been awake for the entire night at this point, running on nothing but coffee, spite, and the righteous indignation of a man who'd been wronged, my front yard had transformed into something that looked less like a peaceful suburban property and more like the staging area for a low-budget reality TV show about family dysfunction. I'm talking cars parked at weird angles all over the street, people I was related to by marriage standing on my lawn looking concerned and confused, and enough dramatic tension in the air to power a small city. It was like someone had sent out an emergency broadcast saying, "Family crisis at Henry's house. All available relatives please report immediately." And everyone had actually shown up. Clara's parents were there, obviously. Margaret looking exhausted but determined, and her dad Robert looking like he wished he was literally anywhere else on planet Earth. Clara's sister Lydia had shown up with her husband Mark, both of them looking like they'd gotten dressed in about 30 seconds and hadn't bothered to check if their clothes matched. And then, because apparently this situation wasn't chaotic enough already, there was Uncle Ray, the forever divorced uncle who showed up to every family gathering with unsolicited advice about relationships despite having failed at every single one of his own. Ray was that relative, you know, the one who thought his 3 divorces made him an expert on marriage instead of a cautionary tale about making terrible life choices repeatedly. I opened my front door to this absolute circus of concerned family members, and honestly, part of me wanted to just close it again and pretend none of this was happening. But the other part of me, the part that was running on fumes and had completely run out of patience for pretending everything was fine, figured why not let this play out? It was already the worst night of my life. Might as well make it a group activity. "Morning, everyone," I said, leaning against my doorframe with the casual energy of someone who is absolutely dead inside but too stubborn to show it. "Welcome to the Henry and Clara Show, season finale, The Affair Revelation. Please keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times, and remember, there's no refunds on emotional damage." Uncle Ray decided to start things off, because of course he did, stepping forward with that self-important energy that only men who think they're wise despite all evidence to the contrary can pull off. "Marriage takes work, Henry," he began, and I had to physically stop myself from laughing in his face because this man, this thrice-divorced man who currently lived alone in a studio apartment with a cat who barely tolerated him, was about to lecture me about making marriage work. "Yeah, Ray," I said, cutting him off before he could really get going on whatever speech he'd prepared during his drive over. "You're absolutely right. Marriage takes work. But the kind of work marriage needs is stuff like communication and compromise, and maybe couples therapy if things get really rough. Not the kind you do at 2 a.m. with your boss in what I'm assuming was either his car or a cheap motel. That's a different kind of work entirely. And it's not the kind that helps a marriage, it's the kind that ends one." Mark, Lydia's husband, and honestly one of the few people in Clara's family I actually liked, made this choking sound like he was trying not to laugh, covering his mouth with his hand and turning away slightly. I caught his eye, and he gave me this subtle nod that said, "Damn, dude, well played," and I appreciated that more than he probably realized in that moment. Lydia folded her arms, her expression shifting from concerned to absolutely pissed in about half a second. She cheated, Uncle Ray. Stop defending stupidity. And that was why I liked Lydia. She didn't sugarcoat things or try to make excuses for bad behavior just because it came from family. She called it like she saw it, and right now, she was seeing her sister very clearly for the first time. Uncle Ray looked like he'd been slapped, his mouth opening and closing like a fish that had suddenly found itself out of water, trying to come up with some response that would re-establish his authority as the family relationship expert. But before he could formulate whatever nonsense he was planning to say, Mark decided to twist the knife a little deeper. "Guess the promotion wasn't the only thing on the table," Mark muttered under his breath, but loud enough that everyone heard it, and I swear to God, even Margaret, who'd been looking generally stern and disappointed, had to turn away to hide what might have been a smile, trying to break through her serious expression. The silence that followed was absolutely golden. That perfect, awkward silence where everyone knows someone just said something savage, but nobody's quite sure if they should acknowledge it or pretend they didn't hear. Clara, who'd been standing off to the side looking like she wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole, turned an even deeper shade of red than I thought was physically possible. Her face went from regular embarrassed pink to full-on fire engine red, and I wondered briefly if she was going to pass out from the sheer humiliation of having her affair discussed in front of her entire family at sunrise in my front yard. "Can we not?" Clara started, her voice small and defeated, but Lydia cut her off with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting years to tell her sister exactly what she thought of her life choices. "Not what? Not talk about the fact that you destroyed your marriage? Not mention that you've been lying to everyone for weeks? Not acknowledge that you threw away a good man for someone who probably still thinks Axe body spray is cologne?" Lydia was on a roll now, and I was absolutely here for it. "I told you that Richard gave off creeper vibes when you first started working there. I told you he was bad news. But you didn't listen because you were too busy being flattered by the attention. He's not a bad man," Clara said quietly, and the moment those words left her mouth, I knew. I just knew that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. You could physically feel the energy in the yard shift, like someone had just flipped a switch that said, "Oh, it's over now." The room, or yard, I guess, since we were outside, froze. And I mean completely froze, like someone had hit pause on reality itself. Margaret's eyes went wide. Robert's face turned red. Lydia's jaw literally dropped open. Mark stopped mid-chuckle. Even Uncle Ray, who'd been trying to formulate some wisdom about forgiveness or second chances or whatever divorced uncles talk about, went completely silent. "Oh, so you're defending your lover now?" I asked, and my voice was so calm, so perfectly level, that it was actually more terrifying than if I'd yelled. "That's the play we're going with here? We're at the, but he's actually a really good guy once you get to know him stage of this disaster? Clara, read the room. Actually, read the yard. Look around at the faces of everyone who drove over here at dawn because they thought you needed support, and tell me if you think defending Richard is really the move right now." Mark couldn't help himself. "Damn, she's still digging," he muttered to Lydia, who was staring at her sister like she'd never seen her before, like Clara had suddenly revealed herself to be an alien wearing a human suit and doing a terrible job of pretending to understand normal human behavior. Even Uncle Ray, the man who'd shown up ready to deliver a speech about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of forgiveness despite having 0 successful marriages in his own history, whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're on your own, kid." And that's when I knew I'd won. Not that this was ever really a competition, but in that moment, watching Clara's own family turn on her one by one as they realized she was still defending the guy she'd cheated with instead of showing any real remorse for what she'd done, I realized that I had the moral high ground, the legal high ground, and the family support high ground. I had all the high grounds. I was standing on top of High Ground Mountain, looking down at Clara in the Valley of Terrible Decisions. Robert, who'd been silent this entire time, finally spoke up. "Clara, honey, I think you should stop talking now." His voice was gentle but firm, the way fathers talk when they're trying to save their children from themselves. "Every word that comes out of your mouth is making this worse." "I just meant," Clara tried again, but Margaret cut her off with a hand gesture that had probably been perfected over 3 decades of parenting. "We know what you meant," Margaret said coldly. "You meant that you've developed feelings for this man, which means this wasn't just a physical affair, it was an emotional one too, which somehow makes it worse, if that's even possible at this point." Lydia turned to me, and her expression was genuinely apologetic. "Henry, I am so sorry. I don't know what happened to her. This isn't the sister I grew up with. The Clara I knew would never." She stopped, shaking her head. "I'm just sorry. You deserved better than this." "Thanks, Lydia," I said, and I meant it. It was weirdly comforting to know that at least some of Clara's family was on my side, or at least on the side of basic human decency and not cheating on your spouse. Mark stepped forward, clapping me on the shoulder in that way guys do when they don't really know what to say, but want to show support anyway. "You need anything, man, place to crash, someone to help you move stuff, back up at the lawyer's office, just call." "Seriously, I appreciate that," I said, and I did. Mark was good people. Always had been. I made a mental note that in the divorce, I was keeping Mark and Lydia as friends. Clara could have Uncle Ray and his terrible advice. The sun was fully up now, bathing my disaster of a front yard in golden morning light that made everything look way more peaceful than it actually was. Mrs. Henderson was still at her window. I had to give her credit for commitment. And I was pretty sure she was taking notes at this point, probably planning to write a memoir about the most dramatic night in neighborhood history. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, addressing the group like I was leading a board meeting instead of managing a family crisis. "Clara is going to pack her essentials, and I mean essentials, not half the house. And she's going to stay with either you, Margaret, or you, Lydia, whoever volunteers as tribute. I have a meeting with my lawyer in, I checked my phone, about 3.5 hours, and I'd really like to get a shower and maybe 45 minutes of sleep before I have to deal with paperwork. Any objections?" Nobody objected. Even Clara seemed to realize that she'd lost this battle, this war, and probably the next 3 wars after this one. She nodded weakly, looking like she'd aged about 10 years overnight, and started heading toward the house to pack. Watching Clara pack her things was surreal in a way I hadn't expected. This woman who'd shared my life for 8 years was now moving through our bedroom like a stranger, pulling clothes from drawers and hangers with shaking hands while her mother supervised from the doorway, like a prison guard, making sure an inmate didn't try to steal anything on their way out. The whole scene had this weird finality to it, like watching the end credits roll on a movie you'd invested way too much time in only to discover the ending sucked. "Can I at least pack some things?" Clara had asked earlier, her voice small and defeated, and honestly, I'd almost felt bad for her in that moment. Almost. But then I remembered the lipstick and the lies and the 2:30 in the morning text message, and the sympathy evaporated faster than water on hot pavement. Of course, I'd said, gesturing toward the bedroom like a hotel concierge showing a guest to their room. Take whatever you need. Just not my sanity. That's the one thing you don't get to pack in your suitcase and take with you. She'd try to hug me then. Actually reached out with both arms like we were saying goodbye after a normal visit and not ending our entire marriage. And I stepped back so fast I almost tripped over the coffee table. The look on her face when I avoided her touch was something between hurt and shock, like she genuinely couldn't believe I didn't want her anywhere near me after everything that had happened. Save the affection for your performance reviews, I said, and I heard Mark snort from the living room where he and Lydia were pretending not to listen to every word of this conversation. Now, 45 minutes later, Clara had managed to pack 2 suitcases and a duffel bag with Margaret's help, and honestly, I was impressed by the efficiency. Margaret had clearly taken over the operation, making executive decisions about what was essential and what could be retrieved later, probably because she knew that if she left Clara to her own devices, we'd be here until next Tuesday, while Clara had an emotional breakdown over every item she touched. Lydia had been muttering commentary the entire time from her position in the hallway, little observations like, "You won't need those heels where you're going," and "Pretty sure Henry paid for that dress, maybe leave it," which wasn't technically helpful but was definitely entertaining. Her sister had zero chill, and I respected that about her immensely. When Clara finally emerged from the bedroom, looking like she'd been through an actual war instead of just packing some clothes, she stopped in front of me one last time. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her makeup was completely destroyed, and she had that desperate look that people get when they're trying to figure out if there's any possible way to undo what they've done. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and it was probably the most genuine thing she'd said all night. Not the most useful thing, not the thing that would change anything, but at least it sounded like she meant it. I nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact because I wanted her to see that I was completely serious about what I was about to say. Apology accepted. Marriage revoked. It was clean. Simple. Final. 6 words that ended 8 years of history, and honestly, they felt right. No dramatic speeches, no crying, no last-minute pleas for reconciliation. Just a simple acknowledgement that yes, she was sorry, and yes, it was over anyway. Clara opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else. Probably another apology or an explanation or a plea for me to reconsider. But Margaret put a hand on her shoulder and shook her head. Smart woman, Margaret. She knew when a conversation was over, even if her daughter didn't. They filed out of the house one by one. Margaret first with one of the suitcases, then Lydia with the duffel bag, then Clara with the remaining suitcase, looking back over her shoulder every few steps like she expected me to call her back and tell her this was all some kind of test or joke or elaborate prank. Robert followed behind them all, giving me a nod that said more than words could have, and then Mark, who clapped me on the shoulder one more time and said, "You're gonna be fine, man. Better than fine, actually." The door shut behind them with a soft click that sounded way louder than it should have, and suddenly the house was quiet. Not just quiet, silent. The kind of silence that happens when something major ends and you're left standing in the aftermath, trying to figure out what just happened. I stood there in my entryway for a solid minute, just listening to the nothing, feeling the emptiness of a house that had held 2 people for years suddenly adjusting to holding just one. I walked to the window and watched them load Clara's stuff into Margaret's car, watched Clara get into the back seat like a kid being picked up from a sleepover that had gone badly, watched the car pull away from my curb and disappear around the corner. And when they were gone, really, truly gone, I felt it. Peace. Actual, genuine peace. The kind I hadn't felt in months, maybe longer. The faint smell of freedom hung in the air, mixing with the lingering scent of coffee from earlier, and I realized something important. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. 3 months later, Karma decided to stop taking its sweet time and finally showed up to work. And let me tell you, when Karma clocks in, it doesn't mess around with subtle life lessons or gentle course corrections. No. Karma went straight for the jugular with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for the perfect moment to absolutely demolish some lives. And I was absolutely here for every single delicious second of it. I found out about the whole thing from Mark, actually, who'd heard it from Lydia, who'd heard it from their cousin Jessica, who worked in the same office building as Clara and had front row seats to the absolute dumpster fire that Clara's professional life had become. Apparently, and this is where it gets really good, Richard, the boss, the divorced guy with the allegedly sick dog, the man who Clara had defended as not a bad man, got fired. Not just fired, but spectacularly, publicly, humiliatingly fired for creating a hostile work environment. Here's the thing, though. Richard's wife, the one who Clara claimed was sick except she wasn't actually his wife anymore, turned out to be not quite as ex as everyone thought. Sure, they were divorced on paper, but apparently they'd been trying to work things out, going to couples therapy, the whole 9 yards. And Richard had conveniently forgotten to mention this little detail to Clara during their romantic rendezvous. So when the wife, let's call her Jennifer because that was actually her name, found out about the affair, she didn't just get mad. She got evidence. Jennifer had screenshots, text messages, emails, calendar invites that were definitely not about actual work meetings, expense reports for hotel rooms that Richard had claimed were for client entertainment. She had everything, all compiled into a beautiful folder of receipts that she hand-delivered to HR with the kind of professional thoroughness that suggested she'd been planning this revenge for a while and was savoring every moment of it. HR took one look at that folder, and apparently Richard was escorted out of the building within the hour, his office packed up by security while everyone watched. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. But wait, it gets better. Clara didn't get fired, which honestly might have been more merciful, but she got reassigned. They moved her from her nice office with the window view to a basement desk next to the server room that made this constant humming noise. Her new job responsibilities included refilling printer paper, organizing supply closets, and updating spreadsheets that nobody actually read. Basically, they demoted her to a position that didn't technically exist before they created it specifically to punish her without actually firing her. And the nickname? Oh man, the nickname was just Chef's Kiss Perfect. According to Jessica, Clara's co-workers had started calling her 2 a.m. Clara because apparently word had spread about the circumstances of her affair coming to light. Nothing stays secret in an office environment, especially when the affair involves the boss and ends with him getting publicly fired. People talked, rumors flew, and somehow the detail about the 2:30 in the morning text message had made it into the office gossip circuit. I heard she couldn't walk through the office without people whispering and smirking, couldn't eat lunch in the break room without conversation stopping when she walked in. It was brutal, but also, and I say this with zero guilt, completely deserved. She'd made her choices, and now she got to live with the consequences in the form of eternal office humiliation and a job that made filing papers seem exciting by comparison. The best part? Clara texted me about a month into her new reality. Just one message that appeared on my phone like a ghost from a past life I'd successfully moved on from. I'm in therapy now. I've learned from my mistakes. I stared at that message for about 5 seconds, watching the little dots appear and disappear as she presumably wrote and deleted follow-up messages, trying to figure out what else to say that wouldn't make things worse. Part of me wanted to respond with something cutting, something sarcastic that would let her know exactly how little I cared about her personal growth journey. But then I realized something better. Silence was way more powerful than any response I could craft. I replied with nothing. Didn't even leave her on read. Just never opened the message at all. Let her see that little delivered notification and wonder forever if I'd even bothered to look at it. Let her sit with the uncertainty of not knowing if I'd forgiven her, still hated her, or had simply moved on so completely that she didn't even register as important enough to acknowledge. Silence became my favorite language, especially when it came to Clara. By now, I'd completely turned my life around, and I don't mean that in some vague, inspirational poster kind of way. I mean, I'd literally replaced everything that reminded me of Clara. New couch because the old one had too many memories of us watching terrible reality TV together. New bedding because sleeping on the same sheets felt weird. New routine that involved actually going to the gym instead of just thinking about it. My house felt like mine again, not ours, and that difference was more significant than I'd expected. My neighbor Paul stopped by one Saturday afternoon, looking relieved to escape his own house. Lunch. My wife's out of town visiting her sister, and I'm tired of pretending I know how to cook anything that doesn't come with instructions that say microwave for 3 minutes. We hit this burger place downtown that had been there forever, The kind of place with checkered floors and waitresses who called everyone Han and didn't judge you for ordering fries and onion rings. Paul asked the question everyone had been dancing around for months. So, any regrets? I took a bite of my burger, perfectly cooked, extra pickles, the exact kind of simple pleasure I'd been enjoying more lately, and thought about it. Did I regret how I'd handled things? The sarcasm, the cold efficiency, the way I'd shut Clara out completely? Only that I didn't block her sooner, I said, and I meant it. Paul laughed so hard, he almost choked on his drink. You handled that like a legend, man. Seriously, everyone's been talking about it. You're like the neighborhood hero for standing up for yourself. Later that evening, I was grilling on my patio when Margaret called, which surprised me because we hadn't talked much since the divorce was finalized. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, her voice soft. You handled everything with grace. Grace? Margaret, I handled it with sarcasm and good coffee, but close enough. I replied, flipping a burger with probably more confidence than the situation required. She laughed, really laughed, and it was nice to hear. You deserve better, Henry. You always did. When we hung up, I looked around at my quiet yard, at the grill I'd bought myself last month, at the peace I'd built from the wreckage of my marriage. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I was truly content. No drama, no lies, no wondering where my wife was or who she was with. That one text, no need to explain. Stay with your boss, you're single now, wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of my peace. The beginning of a life where I didn't have to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't, where I could just be myself without worrying about someone else's lies catching up to me. And honestly, I'd never slept better. My bed was mine, my house was mine, my life was mine. And that was worth more than any marriage built on lies could ever be. Disappeared saying she needed me time. I trusted her, until I found out where she really was. When she came home that night, divorce papers were already on her pillow. Her reaction? Unbelievable. My name's Logan Pierce, I'm 36 years old, and I used to think marriage was like a well-cooked lasagna. Layered, comforting, takes genuine effort, and best enjoyed piping hot with someone you actually give a damn about. What I didn't realize, what I was too blind or too stupid or too comfortable to see, was that mine had been sitting in the back of the fridge for months, getting colder and more congealed by the day. Nobody tells you that the hardest part about a failing marriage isn't the dramatic blow-ups or the thrown dishes you see in movies. It's the slow, creeping realization that you've been eating cold leftovers and convincing yourself they still taste fine. Saturdays used to be sacred in our house, and I mean that in the most suburban, beautifully mundane way possible. We'd sleep in until some ungodly hour like 9:30, which felt like noon to us because we're not 20 anymore and hangovers last 3 days now. Then we'd stumble into the kitchen, still half asleep, and attempt to make pancakes while inevitably burning at least two because one of us would get distracted arguing about which show to binge next. We'd spend the afternoon melting into the couch, her feet tucked under my legs, both of us pretending we understood the plot of whatever pretentious documentary she'd picked. Later, we'd drag ourselves to the farmer's market downtown, acting like we cared about organic kale and artisanal honey when really, and I mean really, we just wanted those free cheese samples from the Vermont vendor who never asked questions and had the good stuff. Those Saturdays felt like home, like safety, like the kind of comfortable rhythm you build with someone over years of choosing them every single day. But then something shifted, and it happened so gradually I didn't even notice at first. She started saying she needed me time. Not in a demanding way or anything hostile, just casual mentions here and there. I think I need some me time this weekend, she'd say, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone like it was the most natural thing in the world. And look, I'm not some Neanderthal who thinks wives exist solely for my entertainment. Everyone needs to recharge their batteries, decompress, do whatever the self-care blogs say you're supposed to do to avoid becoming a rage-filled zombie. So I said sure, absolutely, take all the time you need. I'm a supportive husband. I'm evolved. I read articles about emotional labor and everything, except some me time, became every single weekend without fail. Every Saturday, like clockwork, she'd announce her need for solitude and disappear for hours. I started calling it National Alone Day in my head, except the joke wasn't funny because the only person actually alone was me, sitting on our couch. watching shows by myself and eating cereal for dinner like some divorced sad sack. Which, spoiler alert, I basically already was without knowing it. I'd text her casual things like, "Want me to save you some Thai food?" And she'd respond with, "Already ate. Thanks," with an exclamation point that felt aggressive in its cheerfulness. Who the hell was she eating with? Where was she going? These questions started as tiny whispers in the back of my mind, but eventually grew into full-volume screaming. The thing about being the person left behind is that you start noticing everything, and I mean everything. Suddenly you're aware that she's doing her hair differently, that she bought new workout clothes even though she's supposedly going to the same gym she's been going to for 3 years, that she's humming songs you've never heard while making breakfast. You become a detective in your own home, examining clues you wish you'd never found, piecing together a puzzle you'd rather leave incomplete. I'd catch myself staring at her while she got ready to leave, watching her apply mascara in the bathroom mirror with the door halfway open, and I'd think, when did she start wearing mascara to the gym? But I didn't say anything because saying something would make it real, would force a conversation I wasn't ready to have, would potentially blow up the entire life we'd built together. So instead, I stayed quiet and told myself stories. Maybe she really did need time alone. Maybe I was being paranoid and insecure. Maybe marriage was supposed to feel like this after a while. Comfortable enough that you didn't need to spend every waking moment together, mature enough to pursue separate interests and maintain individual identities. All those stupid articles I'd read about healthy relationships talked about the importance of independence and not being codependent and giving each other space to grow. So maybe, just maybe, this was what growth looked like. Maybe I was the one with the problem for wanting us to still act like we did in year one, when we couldn't keep our hands off each other and spend entire Sundays in bed talking about nothing and everything. But deep down, in that gut-level place where you know things before your brain catches up, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. You can feel it in the way someone kisses you, or doesn't, in the way conversations become shorter and less frequent, in how "I love you" transforms from a feeling into an obligation, something you say before hanging up the phone, not because you're overwhelmed with emotion, but because it's what married people are supposed to say. Our marriage had become a performance we were both tired of rehearsing, except I was still trying to remember my lines while she'd apparently found a whole new script with someone else. I remember one Saturday morning specifically, about 3 months into her weekly disappearing act, when I made blueberry pancakes from scratch, the real deal with buttermilk and everything, not that box mix garbage. I even cut up fresh strawberries and whipped cream because I'm not some animal who serves plain pancakes. She came downstairs already dressed in her gym clothes, hair pulled back, smelling like that expensive perfume she usually saved for date nights we never had anymore. "You're not staying for breakfast?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and not accusatory, not desperate. She glanced at the pancakes, then at her watch, then at me with this apologetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rain check," she said. "I really need to get going." And then she was gone, out the door before I could even respond, leaving me standing in our kitchen with a plate full of cooling pancakes and the growing realization that I was slowly, painfully losing my wife to something, or someone, I couldn't see. That's when I stopped calling it National Alone Day and started calling it what it really was. The beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my wife, and my own ability to recognize when I was being played for a complete and total fool. At first, I genuinely thought she'd joined some kind of secret spa cult, the kind where they convince middle-class women that spending $200 on a hot stone massage is investing in yourself, and that drinking overpriced kombucha makes you spiritually enlightened. I pictured her in one of those fluffy white robes, cucumber slices on her eyes, whale sounds playing in the background while some person named Crystal with healing hands told her to release her toxins, or whatever the hell they say in those places. It seemed plausible, honestly. She'd leave around noon every Saturday, always with this little wave and a promise that she'd be back later, which is the vaguest word in the English language and should be illegal in marriage contracts. Then she'd roll back home sometime after dark, usually around 9 or 10, smelling faintly of lavender and what I can only describe as guilt, though at the time I didn't have a name for that particular scent. I told myself she was decompressing from the week, maybe journaling about gratitude and self-love and all those buzzwords that Instagram therapists throw around like confetti. God knows her job was stressful. She worked in marketing for a company that sold organic dog treats to people with more money than sense, and apparently, convincing rich people that their golden doodles needed grain-free biscuits took a psychological toll. So yeah, maybe she needed those Saturdays to herself. Maybe I was being the stereotypical clingy husband who couldn't handle his wife having a life outside their marriage. Maybe I needed to check my own insecurities and be more supportive. I actually said these things to myself out loud while washing dishes alone on Saturday nights, like some kind of self-help podcast playing in my own head. But then I started noticing things, little things that didn't quite add up, like when you're doing a jigsaw puzzle and you find a piece that's clearly from a different box entirely. The car mileage was the first real red flag that smacked me across the face. I'm not proud of this, but one Saturday after she left, I went out to check something in the garage and happened to glance at the odometer in her car. Happened to glance. Right. Who am I kidding? I specifically walked out there to look because my gut was screaming at me and I needed something concrete to either validate or dismiss this growing paranoia eating away at my insides. The mileage read 15 miles more than it had that morning. 15 extra miles. Our gym. The one she'd been a member of for 3 years, the one with the fancy eucalyptus towels and the smoothie bar, was exactly 4 miles away. For miles there, for miles back, that's 8 miles total. Unless the treadmill had somehow developed wheels and relocated to the next county, something wasn't adding up and the math wasn't mathing, as the kids say. I stood there in our garage for probably 10 minutes, just staring at those numbers like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense, something innocent and explainable. Maybe she'd driven to the grocery store afterward? Except we had plenty of food, and she never came home with bags. Maybe she'd gone to get gas, but the tank was still 3/4 full. Maybe she'd taken a scenic route because she needed to clear her head, and driving helped her think? Except my wife hated driving and complained about gas prices constantly, so taking an unnecessary 7-mile joyride seemed wildly out of character. Every explanation I invented felt flimsier than the last, like trying to build a house out of wet tissue paper. Then came the Saturday that really sealed the deal, the one where all my suspicions crystallized into something I could no longer ignore or explain away with mental gymnastics. She came downstairs that morning wearing red lipstick, and I'm not talking about some subtle nude shade or a light pink tint that could pass for natural. I'm talking full-on, stop traffic, look at me red, the kind of red that says, I have plans and you're not invited to them. She was also wearing this black athletic outfit I'd never seen before, the kind that looked more like it belonged on a fitness influencer's Instagram than someone going to casually use an elliptical machine. Her hair was styled, actually styled with product and effort, and she'd put on perfume. Perfume. To go sweat on a Stairmaster surrounded by divorced dads and college kids on winter break. You're going to the gym like that? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual and not accusatory, even though inside I was screaming. She turned and smiled at me, this bright, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said, confidence boost. Just like that. Confidence boost. As if the explanation was perfectly reasonable, and I was weird for questioning why someone needed bright red lipstick and designer workout clothes to run on a treadmill in a fluorescent-lit room that smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. Confidence boost, she repeated, grabbing her keys and her water bottle. A new stainless steel one I'd never seen before, because apparently everything in her life was getting upgraded except our marriage. Yeah, sure, I thought as the garage door closed behind her. Confidence boost. Because nothing says, I'm working on my self-esteem, like dressing up for a stationary bike. Apparently, dumb husbands had become the new self-care accessory, and I was wearing the title like a participation trophy I never asked for. I watched her car pull out of the driveway. That familiar silver sedan I'd helped her pick out 3 years ago when her old one finally died, and I felt something shift inside me. Not quite anger yet, more like resignation mixed with this creeping dread that I'd been living in denial for months, maybe longer. The rest of that day, I spent Googling things I never thought I'd Google, phrases like signs your wife is cheating, and how to tell if your spouse is lying, and am I paranoid or right? Which yielded about 10 million results because apparently I wasn't alone in this particular brand of domestic nightmare. Every article said the same things. Changes in appearance, unexplained absences, new attention to grooming, defensive behavior when questioned, decreased intimacy at home. Check. Check, 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 and check. I was basically playing infidelity bingo and winning every round. Except there was no prize, just this hollow feeling in my chest that felt like someone had scooped out my insides with a rusty spoon. When she came home that night at 9:45, I checked the time because I'd become that person now, the one who monitored comings and goings like a prison warden. She was glowing. Actually glowing. Like she'd just had the best workout of her life, or discovered enlightenment, or, more likely, spent the last several hours doing something that had nothing to do with fitness equipment. The red lipstick was mostly gone, but you could see the faint stain on her lips, and her hair was slightly messed up in a way that didn't look like workout sweat, but more like someone had run their hands through it. She breezed past me in the living room, called out, "Great session today," and headed straight for the shower without making eye contact. I sat there on the couch, Netflix asking me if I was still watching for the third time, and realized that I'd become the punchline to a joke I didn't even know was being told. My wife was living an entire separate life every Saturday, and I'd been too trusting, too comfortable, too damn stupid to see it happening right in front of my face. The worst part wasn't even the lying. It was knowing that she thought I was too oblivious to notice, that she'd looked at me that morning in my old sweatpants and bedhead and calculated that I was safe to deceive, easy to fool, too wrapped up in my own comfortable bubble to question her bright red confidence boost. There's nothing scarier than catching your own reflection looking suspicious, and I mean genuinely unhinged in a way that makes you question who you've become. I'd always been a pretty relaxed guy, the kind of person who didn't sweat the small stuff, who rolled with punches, who prided himself on being easygoing and rational, and not one of those jealous, controlling husbands you see in bad Lifetime movies. But suddenly, seemingly overnight, I'd transformed into Sherlock Holmes except with crippling trust issues and significantly less heroin. I found myself doing things I never thought I'd do, things that would have disgusted past me, things that made me feel dirty and pathetic, but also oddly necessary, because what else was I supposed to do? Just keep pretending everything was fine while my marriage crumbled around me like a stale cookie? The GPS history was my first real investigative move, and let me tell you, it felt both empowering and absolutely soul-crushing at the same time. Modern cars basically track your every movement like you're a criminal on parole, which is great for finding that restaurant you went to 6 months ago, but terrible when you're trying to hide an affair. I waited until she was in the shower one Sunday morning, steam pouring out from under the bathroom door, and I grabbed her car keys like some kind of suburban spy. My hands were actually shaking as I sat in the driver's seat and pulled up the navigation history, which should have been full of addresses and timestamps that would finally give me answers that would either confirm my suspicions or prove I was losing my mind over nothing. Except it was gone. Completely wiped. Empty. The screen showed absolutely nothing, like she'd never driven the car anywhere ever, like it had sat in our garage and used since the day we bought it. The history had been deleted, meticulously erased, and you don't delete your GPS history unless you have something to hide. Innocent people don't scrub their digital footprints. People going to the gym don't need to cover their tracks. The emptiness of that screen told me more than any address could have, and I sat there in her car in our garage, feeling my stomach drop to somewhere around my feet. She knew. She knew I might check. She was being careful, calculating, which meant this wasn't some spontaneous thing or a confused moment of weakness. This was planned, ongoing, and sophisticated enough that she was taking countermeasures. I stumbled back into the house feeling like I'd been punched in the throat, trying to arrange my face into something normal before she came out of the bathroom. When she emerged 10 minutes later wrapped in a towel with her hair wet and her skin pink from the heat, she smiled at me like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't just confirmed every fear I'd been harboring by virtue of what she'd deliberately hidden. "Morning," she said cheerfully, kissing my cheek as she passed. Her lips felt like ice even though she'd just stepped out of a hot shower. I managed to mumble something back, but I don't even remember what. Probably just some grunt that could pass for communication. The questions started that same day, casual little probes disguised as normal husband conversation, each one a tiny test to see how she'd react. "Where were you today?" I asked that afternoon while we were both in the kitchen, her making tea and me pretending to read something on my phone. She was stirring honey into her mug, that little spoon clinking against ceramic, and she didn't even pause. "The gym," she said, blinking at me with these wide, innocent eyes like I'd asked her the color of the sky. "Why?" That single word hung between us, suspicious and defensive, turning my simple question into an interrogation I hadn't meant to start. I shrugged, going for casual and probably missing by a mile. Just making sure you didn't join the Navy without telling me. It was supposed to be a joke, the kind of dumb husband humor I usually deployed to defuse tension, but it landed flat. She didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She just stared at me for a long moment with this unreadable expression, something between annoyance and fear, before turning back to her tea and saying, "You're being weird." And maybe I was being weird, but weird seemed like a pretty reasonable response to discovering your wife was systematically lying to you and covering her digital tracks like a mob boss. That night, I couldn't sleep, which was becoming a regular occurrence and probably taking years off my life from stress alone. I lay in bed next to her, listening to her breathe, watching the rise and fall of the blanket, and wondering who she'd been with earlier that day, wondering what they talked about, wondering if she laughed with him the way she used to laugh with me before everything got stale. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely and went downstairs to the living room, flipping on a single lamp and just sitting there in the semi-darkness like some kind of depression commercial. Our wedding photo sat on the bookshelf across from the couch, this big 8x10 in a silver frame that her mother had given us as a gift. We looked so young in it, so stupidly happy, both of us grinning like we'd won the lottery and couldn't believe our luck. She wore white, obviously, with flowers in her hair, and I wore a suit that was too big in the shoulders because I'd lost weight from wedding stress. We were 26 and 25, respectively, convinced we'd figured out something that most people missed, that our love was different and special and immune to the statistics about divorce rates and infidelity and growing apart. Looking at that photo now felt like looking at strangers, people I used to know but didn't recognize anymore, people who had no idea what was coming. I wondered if past me, that goofy kid in the too big suit, would punch present me for letting things get this bad, for missing the signs, for being so comfortably oblivious that my wife felt confident enough to maintain an entire secret life. Or would he just hand me a drink and commiserate, acknowledging that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes people change in ways you can't predict or prevent, that marriage is just as much about luck and timing as it is about commitment and effort? Probably the drink, honestly. Past me was pretty non-confrontational. The rest of that week, I became someone I didn't recognize, someone obsessive and paranoid and constantly on edge. I checked her phone when she was in the shower, password protected, of course, changed from the one I used to know. I looked through her emails on the computer, nothing suspicious, which meant she was using an account I didn't know about. I even briefly considered following her one Saturday, but talked myself out of it, because that felt like a line I wasn't ready to cross, a level of crazy I hadn't quite reached yet. Every interaction between us became a performance, me pretending everything was normal while mentally cataloging every inconsistency, every strange detail, every moment that confirmed what I already knew but wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. The mirror in our bathroom became my enemy. Every morning I'd brush my teeth and catch my own reflection looking back at me with these tired eyes and this suspicious expression, and I'd think, this is what betrayal looks like. Not dramatic or cinematic, not some big revelation with shouting and tears, but just this slow erosion of trust that turns you into a detective in your own home, that makes you question every word and doubt every explanation, that transforms casual conversations into cross-examinations. I looked older suddenly, more worn down, like I'd aged 5 years in 5 weeks. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there before, gray hairs popping up at my temples that I swear appeared overnight. This general sense of defeat hanging over me like a cloud. She asked me once during this period if I was okay, if something was bothering me, and the irony was so thick I almost choked on it. Was something bothering me? Oh, nothing much. Just the complete destruction of my marriage and the growing certainty that my wife was cheating on me every single weekend while I sat at home like an idiot eating takeout and watching TV shows we used to watch together. But instead of saying any of that, I just smiled and said I was tired, work was stressful, nothing to worry about. Because what was the alternative? Confronting her without proof? Accusing her based on suspicions and deleted GPS history? I needed something concrete, something undeniable, something she couldn't explain away or turn around on me. So I lived in this bizarre limbo, knowing but not knowing, suspecting but not confirming, going through the motions of marriage while internally preparing for its end. And the whole time, the mirror kept showing me this stranger with suspicious eyes, and I kept wondering when exactly I'd stopped recognizing myself. My buddy Eli, who's been divorced twice and wears it like a badge of honor he didn't want but earned anyway, said something to me about 3 weeks into my spiral that hit way too close to home. We were at a sports bar watching a game neither of us cared about, drinking beers that tasted like regret and broken promises, and I made some offhand comment about how my wife needed so much space lately. He stopped mid-sip, put his beer down with this heavy thud that made the bartender look over, and said, "Logan, let me tell you something I learned the hard way, twice. If she starts saying she needs space, she's already sharing someone else's." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was telling me the score of the game or commenting on the weather. No judgment in his voice, just this tired wisdom that comes from getting burned repeatedly by the same fire. I laughed when he said it, this hollow sound that didn't reach any genuine part of me. Because what else do you do when someone verbalizes your worst fear in the middle of a Tuesday night at Hooligans Bar and Grill? You laugh it off, you make a joke about him being cynical, you change the subject to literally anything else. But that comment burrowed into my brain like a parasite and set up permanent residence there, playing on repeat every time she walked out the door with her gym bag and her secrets. Eli was 2 for 2 in failed marriages, sure, but maybe that didn't make him pessimistic. Maybe it just made him experienced. Maybe he could see things I was still desperately trying not to see. The next morning, I did something I never thought I'd do, something that felt both empowering and like a complete admission of defeat. I called Bill Hargrove, a lawyer whose name I'd gotten from a coworker who'd gone through a messy divorce last year and came out the other side relatively intact, at least financially. Bill had an office downtown in one of those buildings that looks like every other office building. Lots of glass and steel and the faint smell of corporate despair. I told the receptionist I needed to speak with him about a personal matter, which is apparently code for my marriage is imploding and I need professional help, because she got me an appointment for that same afternoon without asking any follow-up questions. Bill Hargrove looked exactly like you'd expect a divorce lawyer to look. Gray hair styled in a way that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Expensive suit that fit perfectly, wire-rimmed glasses that made him look scholarly and intimidating at the same time. He had this office with dark wood furniture and leather chairs and diplomas on the wall from schools I couldn't afford to visit, let alone attend. He looked like the type of guy who could draft divorce papers blindfolded while simultaneously negotiating a settlement and maybe performing minor surgery on the side. There was this aura of competence around him that was both comforting and terrifying, because hiring Bill Hargrove meant this was real, meant I was actually considering blowing up my entire life based on suspicions I couldn't yet prove. I sat down in one of those leather chairs that probably cost more than my first car and tried to explain my situation without sounding like a paranoid lunatic. "I think my wife is cheating on me," I said, and hearing the words out loud made my chest feel tight, made the whole thing suddenly concrete instead of just theoretical. Bill didn't react, didn't show surprise or sympathy or anything really, just pulled out a legal pad and a pen and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the Saturdays, the deleted GPS history, the red lipstick, the extra mileage, all of it spilling out in this rambling confession that probably made me sound unhinged. He took notes the entire time, his pen scratching across the paper in neat, organized lines while my life fell apart in messy, disorganized chunks. When I finished, he looked up at me with these sharp blue eyes and said, "You need proof." Not, "Are you sure?" or "Have you tried couples counseling?" or any of the things I half expected him to say. Just straight to the point. "You need proof." I must have looked confused or lost because he continued, "I believe you. Your story has all the hallmarks, and my gut says you're right. But beliefs don't hold up in court or in divorce proceedings. You need evidence. Concrete, undeniable evidence." He paused, tapping his expensive pen against his legal pad, then opened his desk drawer and pulled out a business card. "Private investigator. Quiet guy. Gets results. Tell him I sent you." The card was plain white with black lettering, no fancy logo or tagline, just a name, Leo Castillo, and a phone number. It felt heavy in my hand, heavier than a piece of cardstock had any right to feel, like it carried the weight of every decision I was about to make. I just wanted advice, I said weakly, though we both knew that was bullshit. Nobody makes an appointment with a divorce lawyer for friendly advice. You don't show up at a law office downtown because you're having minor marital disagreements. You show up because your world is ending and you need someone who's seen this movie before to tell you how it ends. Bill leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in that way lawyers do when they're about to say something you don't want to hear but need to. Mr. Pierce, you came here for a reason. Maybe you're not ready to admit it to yourself yet, but you know what's happening. The question isn't whether your wife is cheating. You already know the answer to that. The question is whether you're ready to do something about it. He was right, of course. I'd known since the red lipstick, maybe even before that. I'd just been too scared or too comfortable or too whatever to fully acknowledge it. I left his office with the business card burning a hole in my pocket and this strange sense of relief mixed with dread. Relief because I'd finally taken action, because I wasn't just sitting around waiting to be made a fool of anymore. Dread because there was no going back from this. Because calling Leo Castillo meant setting wheels in motion that would inevitably lead somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. The elevator ride down felt like descending into a different version of my life. One where I was a man who hired private investigators and consulted divorce lawyers instead of a guy who made pancakes on Saturday mornings and believed in happy endings. That's how I met Leo 3 days later, in a diner on the east side of town that looked like it hadn't been renovated since 1987 and smelled like bacon grease and broken dreams. I'd expected someone out of a noir film, trench coat, fedora, maybe a cigarette dangling from his lips, and a world-weary attitude. What I got was the most unbothered man I've ever encountered in my entire life, sitting in a corner booth wearing cargo shorts, a Hawaiian shirt, and honest-to-God Crocs. Crocs. The man I was hiring to potentially catch my wife cheating was wearing rubber clogs with holes in them like he'd just come from a backyard barbecue or a very casual beach wedding. "You Logan?" he asked when I approached, not standing up or offering to shake hands, just looking up at me with these calm brown eyes that had probably seen every variation of human betrayal imaginable. I nodded and slid into the booth across from him, suddenly feeling overdressed in my jeans and button-up shirt. There was a piece of lemon meringue pie in front of him, about half eaten, and he took another bite before gesturing for me to talk. "Bill says you need surveillance," he said around the mouthful of pie, completely unfazed by the situation or the fact that he was currently eating dessert at 10 in the morning. I explained everything again, my third time recounting this particular nightmare, and it got a little easier each time, like I was building up immunity to my own pain through repeated exposure. Leo ate his pie and listened, occasionally nodding, but mostly just chewing thoughtfully, and I genuinely couldn't tell if he was paying attention to my marital crisis or just really focused on his dessert. When I finished, he pushed the empty plate aside, pulled out his own phone, and started typing notes with his thumbs like a teenager texting their friends. "I'll handle it," he said simply, not looking up from his screen. "Give me 3 weeks. I'll follow her Saturdays, document everything, get you what you need." "That's it?" I asked, expecting more questions, or maybe some kind of contract or discussion of payment, or literally anything more formal than a guy in Crocs saying he'd handle it. Leo finally looked up at me and smiled. This small, knowing smile that somehow made me feel like everything would be okay, or at least like I'd hired someone competent despite all evidence to the contrary. "That's it," he confirmed. "I'll email you updates. Don't call her, don't confront her, don't do anything different. Act normal. Let me do my job." He stood up, dropped cash on the table for his pie, and walked out of the diner without another word, leaving me sitting there wondering if I'd just hired a genius or made the worst decision of my life. I genuinely couldn't tell if he meant he'd handle the case or if he'd just really handled that lemon pie, but I guess I was about to find out. 3 weeks later, I got a thick manila envelope slid under my office door like some kind of ominous pizza delivery. Except instead of pepperoni and cheese, it contained photographic evidence of my wife's betrayal and the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life. There was no note attached, no warning text, no phone call to prepare me. Just this fat envelope sitting on my carpet at 7:30 in the morning when I arrived at work, bulging with secrets I'd paid someone to uncover but wasn't actually ready to see. Just vibes, as my younger coworkers would say. Except these were terrible vibes. The kind that make your stomach drop and your hands shake and your brain immediately start bargaining with the universe for a different reality. I stood there staring at it for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds, my coffee getting cold in my hand, my heart doing this weird arrhythmic thing that couldn't possibly be healthy. Part of me wanted to leave it there, just step over it and go about my day pretending it didn't exist. Schrodinger's envelope of infidelity existing in a state where my marriage was both destroyed and intact until I actually opened it and collapsed the quantum waveform. But that's not how real life works, unfortunately. You can't just ignore evidence because it's inconvenient or painful or going to fundamentally alter your entire existence. So I picked it up, felt the weight of it, easily 50 or 60 photos based on the thickness, and walked into my office on legs that felt like they'd been replaced with jello. I sat at my desk, placed the envelope in front of me like it was a bomb I needed to defuse, and just breathed for a minute. My office suddenly felt too small, too quiet, the fluorescent lights too bright and too revealing, like they were illuminating not just the room, but every naive assumption I'd made about my marriage. The envelope had my name written on it in block letters, nothing else, completely anonymous and yet deeply personal in a way that made me feel exposed. Through the window, I could see Barbara from accounting walking past with her morning bagel, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire world was about to implode 3 feet away from her. Life just keeps going, I guess, even when yours is ending. I opened it. Inside were photographs, probably 60 of them if I had to guess, all neatly organized with timestamps printed in the corner like evidence in a criminal trial. Which, I suppose, this kind of was. My wife. A man. A black SUV. Various locations. Each photo was crystal clear, professional quality. The kind of shots that left absolutely zero room for misinterpretation or alternative explanations. Leo and his Crocs had delivered exactly what he'd promised, and I suddenly understood why Bill had recommended him despite his questionable fashion choices. This wasn't some grainy cell phone picture taken from far away that could be explained as coincidence. This was high-definition proof, damning and irrefutable. I flipped through them like flashcards of heartbreak, each one a tiny knife finding a new place to stick. There she was getting into his SUV, laughing at something he'd said. There they were at a coffee shop I didn't recognize, sitting way too close, her hand on his arm in a way that spoke of intimacy and familiarity. There was one of them walking into what looked like a hotel, and my brain tried very hard not to compute what that meant even though it was painfully obvious. Another showed them in his car, and even through the windshield you could see how she looked at him, animated, alive, present in a way she hadn't been with me in months, maybe years. But the one that hit the hardest, the one that made my coffee taste like ash and my chest feel like someone had reached in and squeezed, was a photo of her smiling. Just smiling. Nothing dramatic or explicitly romantic. Just her face captured in a moment of genuine happiness. Except it was a smile I recognized because it used to be mine, the kind of bright, unguarded expression she'd give me when I'd surprise her with her favorite takeout or make a joke that actually landed. That smile belonged to our early years, to Saturday morning pancakes and lazy Sunday afternoons, to a version of us that apparently no longer existed. And now some other guy was getting it, was probably getting all the best parts of her while I got the tired scraps and the elaborate lies. The timestamps mocked me with their consistency and their cruelty. Every single Saturday between 4 and 7 p.m., like clockwork, like a standing appointment on her calendar. The gym translated to a 3-hour date with someone whose face I could now see clearly in high definition. He wasn't particularly handsome. That somehow made it worse. Just average looking, probably around her age, the kind of guy you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Which meant she hadn't left me for someone objectively better or more attractive. She'd left me for someone who probably just paid attention to her, who made her feel seen, who didn't take her for granted the way I apparently had. I found myself staring at one particular photo until my vision went blurry and my coffee went from lukewarm to completely cold. It showed them sitting on a park bench, her head tilted toward him, his arms stretched behind her on the bench back in that casual possessive way that says, "We're together," without actually touching. The timestamp read 5:47 p.m. on a Saturday 3 weeks ago. That night, I couldn't sleep, which was becoming a regular occurrence and probably taking years off my life from stress alone. I lay in bed next to her, listening to her breathe, watching the rise and fall of the blanket and wondering who she'd been with earlier that day, wondering what they talked about, wondering if she laughed with him the way she used to laugh with me before everything got stale. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely and went downstairs to the living room, flipping on a single lamp and just sitting there in the semi-darkness like some kind of depression commercial. Our wedding photo sat on the bookshelf across from the couch, this big 8x10 in a silver frame that her mother had given us as a gift. We looked so young in it, so stupidly happy, both of us grinning like we'd won the lottery and couldn't believe our luck. She wore white, obviously, with flowers in her hair, and I wore a suit that was too big in the shoulders because I'd lost weight from wedding stress. We were 26 and 25, respectively, convinced we'd figured out something that most people missed, that our love was different and special and immune to the statistics about divorce rates and infidelity and growing apart. Looking at that photo now felt like looking at strangers, people I used to know but didn't recognize anymore, people who had no idea what was coming. I wondered if past me, that goofy kid in the too big suit, would punch present me for letting things get this bad, for missing the signs, for being so comfortably oblivious that my wife felt confident enough to maintain an entire secret life. Or would he just hand me a drink and commiserate, acknowledging that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes people change in ways you can't predict or prevent, that marriage is just as much about luck and timing as it is about commitment and effort? Probably the drink, honestly. Past me was pretty non-confrontational. The rest of that week, I became someone I didn't recognize, someone obsessive and paranoid and constantly on edge. I checked her phone when she was in the shower, password protected, of course, changed from the one I used to know. I looked through her emails on the computer, nothing suspicious, which meant she was using an account I didn't know about. I even briefly considered following her one Saturday, but talked myself out of it, because that felt like a line I wasn't ready to cross, a level of crazy I hadn't quite reached yet. Every interaction between us became a performance, me pretending everything was normal while mentally cataloging every inconsistency, every strange detail, every moment that confirmed what I already knew but wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. The mirror in our bathroom became my enemy. Every morning I'd brush my teeth and catch my own reflection looking back at me with these tired eyes and this suspicious expression, and I'd think, this is what betrayal looks like. Not dramatic or cinematic, not some big revelation with shouting and tears, but just this slow erosion of trust that turns you into a detective in your own home, that makes you question every word and doubt every explanation, that transforms casual conversations into cross-examinations. I looked older suddenly, more worn down, like I'd aged 5 years in 5 weeks. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there before, gray hairs popping up at my temples that I swear appeared overnight. This general sense of defeat hanging over me like a cloud. She asked me once during this period if I was okay, if something was bothering me, and the irony was so thick I almost choked on it. Was something bothering me? Oh, nothing much, just the complete destruction of my marriage and the growing certainty that my wife was cheating on me every single weekend while I sat at home like an idiot eating takeout and watching TV shows we used to watch together. But instead of saying any of that, I just smiled and said I was tired, work was stressful, nothing to worry about. Because what was the alternative? Confronting her without proof? Accusing her based on suspicions and deleted GPS history? I needed something concrete, something undeniable, something she couldn't explain away or turn around on me. So I lived in this bizarre limbo, knowing but not knowing, suspecting but not confirming, going through the motions of marriage while internally preparing for its end. And the whole time, the mirror kept showing me this stranger with suspicious eyes, and I kept wondering when exactly I'd stopped recognizing myself. My buddy Eli, who's been divorced twice and wears it like a badge of honor he didn't want but earned anyway, said something to me about 3 weeks into my spiral that hit way too close to home. We were at a sports bar watching a game neither of us cared about, drinking beers that tasted like regret and broken promises, and I made some offhand comment about how my wife needed so much space lately. He stopped mid-sip, put his beer down with this heavy thud that made the bartender look over, and said, "Logan, let me tell you something I learned the hard way, twice. If she starts saying she needs space, she's already sharing someone else's. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was telling me the score of the game or commenting on the weather. No judgment in his voice, just this tired wisdom that comes from getting burned repeatedly by the same fire. I laughed when he said it, this hollow sound that didn't reach any genuine part of me. Because what else do you do when someone verbalizes your worst fear in the middle of a Tuesday night at Hooligan's Bar and Grill? You laugh it off, you make a joke about him being cynical, you change the subject to literally anything else. But that comment burrowed into my brain like a parasite and set up permanent residence there, playing on repeat every time she walked out the door with her gym bag and her secrets. Eli was 2 for 2 in failed marriages, sure, but maybe that didn't make him pessimistic. Maybe it just made him experienced. Maybe he could see things I was still desperately trying not to see. The next morning, I did something I never thought I'd do, something that felt both empowering and like a complete admission of defeat. I called Bill Hargrove, a lawyer whose name I'd gotten from a coworker who'd gone through a messy divorce last year and came out the other side relatively intact, at least financially. Bill had an office downtown in one of those buildings that looks like every other office building. Lots of glass and steel and the faint smell of corporate despair. I told the receptionist I needed to speak with him about a personal matter, which is apparently code for my marriage is imploding and I need professional help, because she got me an appointment for that same afternoon without asking any follow-up questions. Bill Hargrove looked exactly like you'd expect a divorce lawyer to look. Gray hair styled in a way that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Expensive suit that fit perfectly, wire-rimmed glasses that made him look scholarly and intimidating at the same time. He had this office with dark wood furniture and leather chairs and diplomas on the wall from schools I couldn't afford to visit, let alone attend. He looked like the type of guy who could draft divorce papers blindfolded while simultaneously negotiating a settlement and maybe performing minor surgery on the side. There was this aura of competence around him that was both comforting and terrifying, because hiring Bill Hargrove meant this was real, meant I was actually considering blowing up my entire life based on suspicions I couldn't yet prove. I sat down in one of those leather chairs that probably cost more than my first car and tried to explain my situation without sounding like a paranoid lunatic. I think my wife is cheating on me, I said, and hearing the words out loud made my chest feel tight, made the whole thing suddenly concrete instead of just theoretical. Bill didn't react, didn't show surprise or sympathy or anything really, just pulled out a legal pad and a pen and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the Saturdays, the deleted GPS history, the red lipstick, the extra mileage, all of it spilling out in this rambling confession that probably made me sound unhinged. He took notes the entire time, his pen scratching across the paper in neat, organized lines while my life fell apart in messy, disorganized chunks. When I finished, he looked up at me with these sharp blue eyes and said, "You need proof." Not, "Are you sure?" or "Have you tried couples counseling?" or any of the things I half expected him to say. Just straight to the point. "You need proof." I must have looked confused or lost because he continued, "I believe you. Your story has all the hallmarks, and my gut says you're right. But beliefs don't hold up in court or in divorce proceedings. You need evidence. Concrete, undeniable evidence." He paused, tapping his expensive pen against his legal pad, then opened his desk drawer and pulled out a business card. "Private investigator. Quiet guy. Gets results. Tell him I sent you." The card was plain white with black lettering, no fancy logo or tagline, just a name, Leo Castillo, and a phone number. It felt heavy in my hand, heavier than a piece of cardstock had any right to feel, like it carried the weight of every decision I was about to make. "I just wanted advice," I said weakly, though we both knew that was bullshit. Nobody makes an appointment with a divorce lawyer for friendly advice. You don't show up at a law office downtown because you're having minor marital disagreements. You show up because your world is ending and you need someone who's seen this movie before to tell you how it ends. Bill leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in that way lawyers do when they're about to say something you don't want to hear but need to. "Mr. Pierce, you came here for a reason. Maybe you're not ready to admit it to yourself yet, but you know what's happening. The question isn't whether your wife is cheating. You already know the answer to that. The question is whether you're ready to do something about it." He was right, of course. I'd known since the red lipstick, maybe even before that. I'd just been too scared or too comfortable or too whatever to fully acknowledge it. I left his office with the business card burning a hole in my pocket and this strange sense of relief mixed with dread. Relief because I'd finally taken action, because I wasn't just sitting around waiting to be made a fool of anymore. Dread because there was no going back from this, because calling Leo Castillo meant setting wheels in motion that would inevitably lead somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. The elevator ride down felt like descending into a different version of my life, one where I was a man who hired private investigators and consulted divorce lawyers instead of a guy who made pancakes on Saturday mornings and believed in happy endings. That's how I met Leo 3 days later, in a diner on the east side of town that looked like it hadn't been renovated since 1987 and smelled like bacon grease and broken dreams. I'd expected someone out of a noir film, trench coat, fedora, maybe a cigarette dangling from his lips, and a world-weary attitude. What I got was the most unbothered man I've ever encountered in my entire life, sitting in a corner booth wearing cargo shorts, a Hawaiian shirt, and honest-to-God Crocs. Crocs. The man I was hiring to potentially catch my wife cheating was wearing rubber clogs with holes in them like he'd just come from a backyard barbecue or a very casual beach wedding. "You Logan?" he asked when I approached, not standing up or offering to shake hands, just looking up at me with these calm brown eyes that had probably seen every variation of human betrayal imaginable. I nodded and slid into the booth across from him, suddenly feeling overdressed in my jeans and button-up shirt. There was a piece of lemon meringue pie in front of him, about half eaten, and he took another bite before gesturing for me to talk. "Bill says you need surveillance," he said around the mouthful of pie, completely unfazed by the situation or the fact that he was currently eating dessert at 10 in the morning. I explained everything again, my third time recounting this particular nightmare, and it got a little easier each time, like I was building up immunity to my own pain through repeated exposure. Leo ate his pie and listened, occasionally nodding, but mostly just chewing thoughtfully, and I genuinely couldn't tell if he was paying attention to my marital crisis or just really focused on his dessert. When I finished, he pushed the empty plate aside, pulled out his own phone, and started typing notes with his thumbs like a teenager texting their friends. "I'll handle it," he said simply, not looking up from his screen. "Give me 3 weeks. I'll follow her Saturdays, document everything, get you what you need." "That's it?" I asked, expecting more questions, or maybe some kind of contract or discussion of payment, or literally anything more formal than a guy in Crocs saying he'd handle it. Leo finally looked up at me and smiled, this small knowing smile that somehow made me feel like everything would be okay, or at least like I'd hired someone competent despite all evidence to the contrary. "That's it," he confirmed. "I'll email you updates. Don't call her, don't confront her, don't do anything different. Act normal. Let me do my job." He stood up, dropped cash on the table for his pie, and walked out of the diner without another word, leaving me sitting there wondering if I'd just hired a genius or made the worst decision of my life. I genuinely couldn't tell if he meant he'd handle the case or if he'd just really handled that lemon pie, but I guess I was about to find out. 3 weeks later, I got a thick manila envelope slid under my office door like some kind of ominous pizza delivery, except instead of pepperoni and cheese, it contained photographic evidence of my wife's betrayal and the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life. There was no note attached, no warning text, no phone call to prepare me. Just this fat envelope sitting on my carpet at 7:30 in the morning when I arrived at work, bulging with secrets I'd paid someone to uncover but wasn't actually ready to see. Just vibes, as my younger coworkers would say, except these were terrible vibes, the kind that make your stomach drop and your hands shake and your brain immediately start bargaining with the universe for a different reality. I stood there staring at it for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds, my coffee getting cold in my hand, my heart doing this weird arrhythmic thing that couldn't possibly be healthy. Part of me wanted to leave it there, just step over it and go about my day pretending it didn't exist. Schrodinger's envelope of infidelity existing in a state where my marriage was both destroyed and intact until I actually opened it and collapsed the quantum waveform. But that's not how real life works, unfortunately. You can't just ignore evidence because it's inconvenient or painful or going to fundamentally alter your entire existence. So I picked it up, felt the weight of it, easily 50 or 60 photos based on the thickness, and walked into my office on legs that felt like they'd been replaced with jello. I sat at my desk, placed the envelope in front of me like it was a bomb I needed to defuse, and just breathed for a minute. My office suddenly felt too small, too quiet, the fluorescent lights too bright and too revealing, like they were illuminating not just the room, but every naive assumption I'd made about my marriage. The envelope had my name written on it in block letters, nothing else, completely anonymous and yet deeply personal in a way that made me feel exposed. Through the window, I could see Barbara from accounting walking past with her morning bagel, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire world was about to implode 3 feet away from her. Life just keeps going, I guess, even when yours is ending. I opened it. Inside were photographs, probably 60 of them if I had to guess, all neatly organized with timestamps printed in the corner like evidence in a criminal trial. Which, I suppose, this kind of was. My wife. A man. A black SUV. Various locations. Each photo was crystal clear, professional quality. The kind of shots that left absolutely zero room for misinterpretation or alternative explanations. Leo and his Crocs had delivered exactly what he'd promised, and I suddenly understood why Bill had recommended him despite his questionable fashion choices. This wasn't some grainy cell phone picture taken from far away that could be explained as coincidence. This was high-definition proof, damning and irrefutable. I flipped through them like flashcards of heartbreak, each one a tiny knife finding a new place to stick. There she was getting into his SUV, laughing at something he'd said. There they were at a coffee shop I didn't recognize, sitting way too close, her hand on his arm in a way that spoke of intimacy and familiarity. There was one of them walking into what looked like a hotel, and my brain tried very hard not to compute what that meant even though it was painfully obvious. Another showed them in his car, and even through the windshield you could see how she looked at him, animated, alive, present in a way she hadn't been with me in months, maybe years. But the one that hit the hardest, the one that made my coffee taste like ash and my chest feel like someone had reached in and squeezed, was a photo of her smiling. Just smiling. Nothing dramatic or explicitly romantic, just her face captured in a moment of genuine happiness. Except it was a smile I recognized because it used to be mine, the kind of bright, unguarded expression she'd give me when I'd surprise her with her favorite takeout or make a joke that actually landed. That smile belonged to our early years, to Saturday morning pancakes and lazy Sunday afternoons, to a version of us that apparently no longer existed. And now some other guy was getting it, was probably getting all the best parts of her while I got the tired scraps and the elaborate lies. The timestamps mocked me with their consistency and their cruelty. Every single Saturday between 4 and 7 p.m., like clockwork, like a standing appointment on her calendar. The gym translated to a 3-hour date with someone whose face I could now see clearly in high definition. He wasn't particularly handsome. That somehow made it worse. Just average looking, probably around her age, the kind of guy you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Which meant she hadn't left me for someone objectively better or more attractive. She'd left me for someone who probably just paid attention to her, who made her feel seen, who didn't take her for granted the way I apparently had. I found myself staring at one particular photo until my vision went blurry and my coffee went from lukewarm to completely cold. It showed them sitting on a park bench, her head tilted toward him, his arms stretched behind her on the bench back in that casual possessive way that says, "We're together," without actually touching. The timestamp read 5:47 p.m. on a Saturday 3 weeks ago. Remembered that Saturday specifically because when she'd come home, I'd asked how her workout was, and she'd said, "Great, really pushed myself today," with a straight face, and I believed her because I was still clinging to the delusion that my wife wouldn't look me in the eye and lie. My phone was in my hand before I consciously decided to pick it up, Bill Hardro's number already pulled up from my recent calls. It rang twice before he answered with his professional lawyer voice, probably expecting a client with a standard legal question, not a man whose entire existence had just been validated and destroyed simultaneously. "Let's move forward," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant like it was coming from someone else entirely. Someone who had their shit together and knew what they were doing instead of a guy whose hands were literally trembling while holding evidence of his wife's affair. Bill paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background, the sounds of a functional office where people did normal work and didn't have their lives falling apart in real time. "You sure?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that wasn't quite sympathy, but maybe understanding. The voice of someone who'd guided countless people through this exact moment and knew the weight of what came next. He was giving me one last chance to back out, to shove the photos back in the envelope and pretend I'd never seen them, to choose willful ignorance over painful truth. Bill, I've been sure since she wore perfume to the gym, I said, and saying it out loud crystallized something inside me, turned all that suspicion and paranoia and denial into cold, hard resolve. I was done being the clueless husband. I was done making excuses for behavior that had no excuse. I was done eating cold lasagna and pretending it was still good. I want to proceed with the divorce. Draw up the papers. Let's end this before I waste any more of my life on someone who checked out of our marriage months ago. There was another pause, longer this time, and then Bill's voice came back all business. I'll have everything ready by Monday. We'll file on grounds of adultery, which in this state affects asset division and can expedite the process. Do you want to pursue any specific arrangements regarding property, or, he kept talking, laying out options and procedures and legal strategies. But I was only half listening because I was still staring at that photo of her smiling, trying to pinpoint exactly when I'd lost her, when we'd gone from partners to strangers who shared a mortgage and a last name, but nothing else that mattered. I spent the rest of that day in my office with the door closed, telling my assistant I wasn't taking calls and to reschedule my meetings. The photos stayed spread across my desk like a morbid gallery exhibition titled The Death of a Marriage, or maybe 60 Ways to Realize You're an Idiot. I kept picking them up and putting them down, torturing myself with details I didn't need to notice but couldn't help seeing. The way she'd styled her hair differently for him, the outfit I'd never seen her wear at home, the body language that spoke of comfort and attraction and all the things that had evaporated from our relationship like morning dew under harsh sunlight. Around 3 in the afternoon, Eli texted asking if I wanted to grab drinks after work. I almost said no, almost told him I needed to be alone with my misery and my photographs and my shattered illusions. But then I thought about going home to the house I shared with someone who'd been systematically betraying me for months, about pretending everything was fine through dinner and then lying awake all night staring at the ceiling. And suddenly a bar with a friend who'd already survived this twice sounded like exactly what I needed. Yeah, I texted back. I'm gonna need several drinks actually. Maybe all the drinks. Is all the drinks an option? It's always an option, he replied. That kind of day? I looked at the photographs one more time, at her smile and his face and the evidence of a secret life I'd funded with joint bank accounts and mortgage payments and grocery money. That kind of life. I typed back, then started gathering the photos to put back in their envelope of doom. Each one a nail in the coffin of a marriage that had apparently died without me noticing until it was already decomposing. The papers were ready by Monday, exactly as Bill had promised, because apparently lawyers are the only professionals who actually meet their deadlines when your life is falling apart. They arrived in another manila envelope, though this one came via courier instead of mysteriously appearing under my door, which somehow made it feel more official and terrifying. The documents were clean, sharp, professional, like a legal haircut, all precise lines and no room for interpretation or second-guessing. Petition for dissolution of marriage. It read across the top in bold letters that might as well have said, "Your marriage is officially dead. Please sign here." Grounds, adultery. It was right there in black and white. Legal terminology transforming my wife's Saturday hobby into courtroom language that stripped away all the emotion and left just the cold facts. But I didn't hand them over immediately, didn't storm into the house waving papers and demanding explanations or confessions or whatever the scorned spouse is supposed to do in these situations. I'd seen enough movies to know that route led to screaming matches and thrown dishes and dramatic confrontations that nobody actually wins. Instead, I wanted something different. Peace, closure, maybe just one final moment of control in a situation where I'd felt powerless for months. So I waited one more Saturday, planned it out like some kind of twisted farewell performance, a final curtain call before the whole show shut down permanently. Saturday morning, I woke up early, earlier than I had in weeks, with this strange sense of purpose humming through my veins. I made her breakfast, the whole elaborate spread I used to make back when we were happy, or at least pretending to be. Scrambled eggs cooked low and slow the way she liked them, avocado toast on that expensive sourdough from the bakery downtown, and an almond butter smoothie with bananas and honey, because she was always on some health kick that I never quite understood, but supported anyway. Basically, I made the forgiveness combo, the meal that in our early years would follow any argument or rough patch, the culinary olive branch that said I'm sorry and I love you, and let's move past this. She came downstairs around 9, hair still messy from sleep, wearing one of my old college t-shirts that had become her unofficial pajama top, and her face lit up when she saw the spread on the kitchen table. "You're sweet," she said, sliding into her chair with this genuine smile that would have melted me completely if I didn't know exactly where she'd be in a few hours. Sweet. That's what I was. Sweet, oblivious, convenient. Pick your adjective for the husband who makes breakfast while his wife plans her afternoon affair. "You're busy every weekend," I said, keeping my voice light and casual, just making conversation while I sipped my coffee and watched her eat the eggs I'd carefully prepared. "I figured I'd feed you before you vanish again." It came out more bitter than I'd intended, a little edge creeping into my tone despite my best efforts. But she either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. She laughed, actually laughed, this carefree sound that made me want to throw my coffee mug against the wall just to hear something shatter the way my chest felt constantly shattered lately. Her eyes did that guilty twitch, though, that little micro-expression I'd become an expert at reading over the past few months. Just a tiny flicker, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and I was always looking for it now. "I appreciate it," she said, taking a sip of the smoothie and making that satisfied sound she always made when food was particularly good. "This is really thoughtful." Thoughtful. Right. I was being thoughtful by preparing a last meal before serving divorce papers. Marie Antoinette would be proud. By noon she was getting ready, the familiar routine I'd watched dozens of times now with entirely different eyes. Gym clothes that cost more than regular clothes and somehow looked better than anything in my wardrobe. Hair done carefully, makeup applied, perfume sprayed. The whole production of dressing up for exercise that I'd questioned so many times in my head but never out loud. Not until it was too late and the questions didn't matter anymore. "Have a good workout," I called out as she grabbed her keys, and she turned and blew me a kiss. Actually blew me a kiss like we were in some romantic comedy and not a tragedy disguised as a marriage. "Love you," she said. Those two words that had become completely meaningless through repetition and insincerity. Just sounds people make when leaving the house because it's expected and habitual. "You too," I replied, and watched her drive away for what I knew would be one of the last times as my wife. The garage door closed behind her, and I sat there in the sudden silence of our house. This space we'd built together that had somehow become a stage for elaborate lies and Saturday disappearances. I poured myself a glass of wine, even though it was barely past noon, because day drinking felt appropriate for the occasion, opened the manila envelope that had been sitting in my home office all week, and carried the divorce papers upstairs to our bedroom. I placed them on her pillow, right where her head would rest tonight, when she came home smelling of lavender and guilt and whatever cologne he wore. It felt poetic somehow, symmetrical. She'd been sleeping next to me while betraying me. So now she could come home to papers on her pillow announcing the consequences. I stood there looking at our bed, this king-sized symbol of intimacy and partnership that had become just a place where two strangers slept facing opposite directions and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just this vast emptiness where my marriage used to be. The rest of the afternoon I spent pretending to read a book I'd bought as a joke called Emotional Stability for Dummies, which was actually pretty helpful despite being intended as humor. I learned that acceptance was the final stage of grief, and apparently I'd speedrun through all the others: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, in record time. Now I was just waiting, calm and resolved, for her to come home and discover that the oblivious husband she'd been lying to had finally woken up and decided he deserved better than being someone's safety net while they explored other options. When she walked in that night around 9:15, I was sitting on the couch in the living room with all the lights on, which was unusual because normally I'd be upstairs or in the kitchen or anywhere but positioned directly in her path, like some kind of intervention waiting to happen. I'd stationed myself there deliberately, my prop book about emotional stability sitting in my lap open to a random page I hadn't actually read, and I was pretending to be deeply interested in whatever wisdom it offered about maintaining your sanity when your entire world had gone sideways. She came through the door with her gym bag slung over her shoulder, hair slightly messed up in that way I now recognized as post-affair rather than post-workout, and she was humming something under her breath, probably some song he'd played in his car or whispered in her ear or whatever the hell cheaters do during their 3-hour Saturday sessions. She froze when she saw me, actually physically stopped mid-step like someone had pressed pause on her entire existence. Her eyes went wide and I watched in real time as her brain tried to calculate what was happening, why I was sitting there like that, whether this was normal or something else entirely. "What's this?" she asked, her voice doing that thing where it goes up at the end, turning a statement into a question, revealing nervousness disguised as casual curiosity. She was still standing in the entryway, one hand on the doorframe like she might need to make a quick escape, gym bag slowly sliding down her shoulder. "Go upstairs," I said calmly, gesturing toward the staircase with the book still in my other hand. "Check the bedroom." My voice came out steadier than I expected, no anger or emotion, just these simple instructions delivered like I was telling her we were out of milk or needed to pay a bill. She stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to read my expression for clues about what awaited her, then slowly set her gym bag down by the door and headed up the stairs. I could hear her footsteps on each step, that familiar creaking on the fifth one that we'd always meant to fix but never got around to, the sound getting quieter as she reached the landing and turned toward our bedroom. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. Then I heard it, a sharp intake of breath, the kind of sound people make when they've been punched in the gut or received news that fundamentally alters their reality. Footsteps coming back down, faster now, almost running. And then she appeared at the bottom of the stairs clutching the divorce papers in both hands like they might dissolve if she didn't hold them tight enough. Her face had gone completely pale, all the color drained out like someone had pulled a plug, and her eyes were doing this rapid blinking thing that meant she was trying not to cry or trying to process, or maybe both simultaneously. "Divorce papers?" she said, her voice cracking on the second word, holding them up like I might not know what she was referring to, like there could be some other document on her pillow that she was confused about. Her hands were shaking, making the papers rattle slightly. This visual representation of her world tilting on its axis the way mine had been tilted for months without her caring or noticing or giving a single damn. I nodded slowly, closing the emotional stability book with a soft thump that seemed louder than it should in the heavy silence between us. "Surprise," I said, and even I could hear the bitter edge in my voice now, all pretense of calm neutrality evaporating in the face of her shock. "You said you wanted me time. Well, this gives you a lifetime of it. Congratulations, you're free." I stood up from the couch, setting the book on the coffee table with deliberate care, and watched her face cycle through about 17 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. "I can explain," she blurted out, taking a step toward me with her hand outstretched like she was reaching for a lifeline, the papers still clutched in her other hand. Her voice had gone up an octave, panic mode fully activated, and I could see her brain scrambling for an explanation that would make this okay, that would put the pieces back together, that would somehow reset us to before I knew what I knew. "Don't," I said firmly, holding up my hand to stop her approach and her words simultaneously. "Seriously, just don't. This isn't a group project where we collaborate on finding excuses. This isn't a team effort. You already failed the solo test, and there's no makeup exam." I could feel anger rising now, replacing the calm I'd carefully maintained all day, bubbling up from somewhere deep in my chest where I'd been storing it for weeks. "I know about the Saturdays. I know about him. I know about the black SUV and the coffee shops and the hotel and every single lie you've told me," while smiling to my face. Her mouth fell open in this perfect O of shock, like a cartoon character realizing they've been caught, and the papers slipped slightly in her grip. "It's not what you think," she whispered, which had to be the most cliché thing anyone has ever said when caught cheating, like there was some secret context that would make meeting another man every weekend for months totally innocent and explainable. "Oh, good," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm so thick you could probably bottle it and sell it. "So you're not cheating? You're just conducting an emotional field trip every Saturday, taking your feelings on a little adventure, exploring alternative relationship models without bothering to mention it to your actual husband." I started pacing now, unable to stand still, All that stored energy from months of suspicion and investigation and pain finally finding an outlet. Please enlighten me. Tell me what I think is happening versus what's actually happening. Because from where I'm standing with photographic evidence and timestamps and deleted GPS history, it looks pretty fucking clear. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish gasping for air, tears starting to stream down her face in those dramatic tracks that smeared her carefully applied makeup. Logan, she started, but I cut her off again because I'd heard enough, been lied to enough, made a fool of enough to last several lifetimes. The papers are ready. Bill Hargrove is my lawyer. Maybe you've heard of him. He's excellent at divorce cases, especially ones involving adultery. You can get your own lawyer, obviously. We'll divide everything 50-50, except apparently you've already been dividing yourself 50-50 for months now, so maybe you're ahead of the game. I grabbed my jacket from the coat rack, suddenly desperate to be anywhere, but in this house having this conversation, breathing this air thick with betrayal and tears and the death of everything we'd built. Where are you going? She asked, her voice small and broken, still holding those papers like they might turn into something else if she just believed hard enough. Literally anywhere that isn't here, I replied, opening the door and stepping out into the night air that felt crisp and clean compared to the suffocating atmosphere inside. I suggest you read those papers carefully and sign them. Or don't. Either way, we're done. This marriage ended months ago. I'm just making it official. I slept like a man who'd finally turned off a years-long alarm clock that had been going off in the background of his life. That constant low-level anxiety and suspicion and dread that had been my soundtrack for months suddenly silenced by the simple act of taking control and making a decision. I crashed at Eli's place that night, on his couch that smelled faintly of beer and regret, but felt more comfortable than my own bed had in ages. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't lie awake staring at the ceiling wondering where my wife really was, or what she was really doing, or who she was really with. I knew now. I'd known for weeks. And more importantly, I'd done something about it instead of just marinating in my own misery and playing the role of oblivious husband. The next morning my phone lit up around 7 with a text from her. Just 2 words that appeared on my screen while I was drinking Eli's terrible coffee that tasted like it had been made sometime during the Reagan administration and reheated multiple times since.